A water-stained folio sits in a climate-controlled case at the British Library, catalogue number OR 485, written in Jazz on vellum that has been dated to the 15th century but which scholars agree copies a text that is at least 2,000 years older than the parchment itself. It contains roughly 20 chapters of the Book of Enoch that almost nobody outside academic circles has ever heard summarized correctly. Not the fallen angels, not the giants, not the flood. A different section entirely, one that describes, in exhausting mechanical detail, how the sky operates, the gates the sun passes through, the chambers where weather is stored before it is released, the winds that hold the vault of heaven in place, the order the stars are supposed to keep and what happens when they don't. This section is called the Book of Luminaries by scholars, or the Astronomical Book, and it makes up close to a quarter of the entire text of Enoch. Church leaders removed the whole document from the Bible in 364 CE at the Council of Laodicea. For 17 centuries, it stayed removed, filed under Apocrypha, treated as theological curiosity at best. Then in 1947, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were pulled out of a cave near Qumran, 4 separate fragments of this exact astronomical section turned up among them, catalogued today as 4Q208 through 4Q211, written in Aramaic and dated by paleographers to the 2nd century BCE, which means this material was already old when it was copied onto those fragments. Someone was preserving it, carefully, in the desert, centuries before Rome ever convened a council to decide what belonged in Scripture and what didn't. What the fragments contain is not prophecy in the way most people think of biblical prophecy. There are no riddles here, no symbolic beasts, no coded warnings dressed up in metaphor. The astronomical chapters of Enoch read like a technical manual. They describe 12 gates set into the eastern horizon and 12 set into the western horizon, 6 for the sun to rise and set through on a rotating schedule, 6 for the moon on its own separate schedule, and they specify, gate by gate, how many days the sun spends rising and setting through each one before it moves to the next. They give the exact day counts for a 364-day solar year built entirely around this gate system. They describe cosmic winds positioned at the 4 corners of the earth that keep the sky itself from collapsing. They describe storehouses, actual chambers, where hail and snow and frost and dew and rain are kept before angels open the doors and release them onto the world on a schedule tied to the same gate system. And then, embedded inside all of this careful, repetitive, almost bureaucratic detail, the text makes a claim that should not be there. It says, the order will break. It says a specific class of stars, ones it calls chiefs, will stop following the paths assigned to them. It says when that happens, the calendar itself becomes unreliable, the seasons stop arriving when they should, and this failure of celestial order is presented not as some distant apocalyptic flourish but as a mechanical consequence, the same way a machine with drifting parts eventually throws off its own timing. That third claim, the disordered chiefs of the stars, is the one worth sitting with for a moment, because it is the one that has a live, current, actively reported parallel happening right now in solar and geomagnetic monitoring data, and we are going to spend real time on exactly what that parallel is and is not. But it is only the third of 7 specific things this astronomical section says about the sky, and the other 6 deserve the same careful treatment, because each of them, when placed next to what modern atmospheric science, geophysics, and orbital mechanics have independently documented over the last several decades, produces the same uncomfortable pattern. A text assembled at least 22 centuries ago describing sky mechanics with a level of structural specificity that has no obvious explanation for how a Second Temple period scribe would have arrived at it, and that keeps intersecting, point by point, with categories of phenomena we did not have the instruments to measure until the last 100 years. Dr. Michael Knibb of King's College London, who produced the standard critical edition and translation of the full Ethiopic text in 1978, wrote in his commentary that the astronomical chapters represent, in his words, the most sustained attempt at systematic cosmology anywhere in the pseudepigraphal literature. He meant that as a literary observation about genre. Most scholars who have engaged with the material since have treated it the same way, as an interesting artifact of ancient Jewish cosmological thinking, worth cataloging, not worth cross-referencing against a satellite feed. That is a defensible position, and we are going to state the mainstream academic case fairly and completely before we do anything else, because this material deserves to be presented honestly rather than sensationally. But there is a separate history running underneath the purely academic one, a history of specific manuscript decisions, specific translation choices, and specific moments where material got quietly dropped, softened, or reclassified in ways that had the cumulative effect of making this section of Enoch far less legible to a general reader than it originally was. Otto Neugebauer, the historian of ancient astronomy, whose work on Babylonian and Egyptian mathematical astronomy remains foundational in the field, wrote a technical study specifically on the Enochic calendar in 1981, published through the Royal Danish Academy, in which he noted that the astronomical scheme in Enoch shows internal mathematical consistency significant enough that it could not have been produced by someone without formal training in the observational astronomy of the period. That paper exists. It is cited exactly 6 times in the following 2 decades, almost entirely by other historians of ancient astronomy, never by mainstream biblical scholarship, and never, as far as we have been able to determine, in any general audience discussion of the Book of Enoch at all. That gap between what the most rigorous technical analysis of this material actually 7 specific things the sky-focused chapters of Enoch state as fact. 7 modern parallels, each one drawn from real, publicly available, peer-reviewed, or agency-published data. And one of them, the third, sitting at the center of an argument that is happening in real scientific literature right now. Whether or not most people watching this have ever heard the phrase Book of Luminaries before today. Before we go further, it is worth being precise about what kind of text we are actually dealing with, because the Book of Enoch, as most people encounter it today, is not one document. It is a composite, 5 originally separate works stitched together sometime before the 3rd century CE into what scholars now call one Enoch, to distinguish it from later Enochic material in Slavonic and Hebrew. The first section, the Book of the Watchers, covers the fallen angels and their imprisonment. That is the part almost every documentary about Enoch focuses on, because it has drama, named villains, and a clean narrative arc. The astronomical book, chapters 72 through 82 in the standard chapter numbering, is the 3rd of the 5 sections, and it has almost none of that. No angels falling from grace, no cosmic trial. Just Enoch, guided by an angel named Uriel, being shown the mechanical operation of the sky, gate by gate, wind by wind, storehouse by storehouse, and told to write all of it down, so that his son Methuselah, and through him future generations, would have an accurate record. That framing matters. The text does not present the astronomical material as vision or allegory. It presents it as instruction, the transmission of working knowledge from a guide who operates the system to a human observer who is told, repeatedly, to record what he is shown with precision because people after him will need it. Matthew Black, whose 1,985 critical edition of the Greek and Aramaic fragments remains a standard reference alongside Nib's Ethiopic translation, observed that the astronomical section reads less like the rest of apocalyptic literature and more like what he called, in his introduction, a didactic technical treatise wearing the narrative clothing of revelation. Black was not arguing the material was literally true. He was making a genre observation that whoever compiled this section understood themselves to be recording operational facts about the cosmos, not composing poetry about it. This didactic framing extends to the specific relationship the text establishes between Enoch and his son Methuselah, who receives the completed record at the end of the astronomical section with explicit instructions to preserve it for future generations. Chapter 82 closes the astronomical book, with Uriel telling Enoch directly that he has shown him everything so that Enoch can, in turn, show Methuselah, and that Methuselah must pass the record on to his own descendants, establishing an explicit chain of transmission built into the text's own internal logic, a document that presents itself, from its very structure, as intended to outlast its original audience and reach readers in generations its compilers could not have specifically anticipated. This self-conscious framing as a document meant for future transmission, rather than a message addressed only to its immediate audience, is itself unusual within the broader corpus of ancient Near Eastern religious literature, most of which addresses its contemporary audience directly, without this kind of explicit, structurally embedded expectation of multi-generational forward transmission, and it is worth keeping in mind across everything that follows in this video, since the text's own internal claim is that it was written specifically to be read by people who would not exist for a very long time after its composition. The manuscript trail behind this material is unusually well documented for a text this old, and that documentation is itself part of the story. The complete Ethiopic version survives in dozens of manuscripts held primarily by the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, with major witnesses including the volume held at the Vatican Library under the designation Cod Vat et 71 and the British Libraries, or 485. Both of these were examined and catalogued by European scholars. Only in the 18th and 19th centuries, well after the Scottish explorer James Bruce brought manuscripts of Enoch back from Ethiopia in 1773, the first time complete copies of the text had circulated in Western Europe in over a millennium. Before that, the only trace of the astronomical book that Western scholarship possessed was a handful of citations in Byzantine chronicles and a few quoted lines in the writings of early Christian authors who had access to a text that had, for everyone else, effectively disappeared. Then in 1947, the discovery at Qumran changed the evidentiary picture entirely. The astronomical fragments found in Cave 4, catalogued as 4Q208 through 4Q211, are written in a form of Aramaic that paleographers place in the 2nd century BCE based on letter formation and orthographic conventions, consistent with other securely dated Qumran material. What makes these fragments significant is not just their age. It is that they preserve numerical tables, actual columns of figures tracking the changing length of daylight and the phases of the moon across a structured calendrical cycle, in a format far more technical and less narrative than the fuller Ethiopic version that survived through the church tradition. J.T. Milik, the scholar originally responsible for cataloging and publishing the Qumran Enoch fragments, noted in his 1976 edition that the Aramaic astronomical material appeared to represent an earlier and more purely technical layer of the tradition, with the narrative framing involving Enoch and Uriel possibly added or expanded in later stages of transmission. The circumstances of the 1947 discovery itself are worth a brief mention here, because they clarify how close this material came to being lost entirely rather than recovered at all. The initial Qumran finds were made by Bedouin shepherds searching Cave 1 near the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea, and the scrolls initially changed hands through antiquities dealers in Bethlehem and Jerusalem before reaching scholarly attention, a chain of custody considerably less controlled than modern archaeological practice would permit, meaning the specific astronomical fragments discussed throughout this video, recovered later from Cave 4 during more systematic excavation in 1952, represent material that survived both nearly 2,000 years of physical preservation in the extremely dry conditions of the Judean desert caves and the far more precarious final decades of transmission through the antiquities trade, before reaching the hands of scholars equipped to recognize and properly catalog what they were looking at. That fragility of survival is worth holding on to as this video moves forward into the specific content of what those fragments and their fuller Ethiopic counterparts actually describe, because everything covered from this point forward depends entirely on a chain of preservation that could easily have broken at multiple points. A Bedouin shepherd who never investigated the cave, an antiquities dealer who destroyed rather than sold an unfamiliar scrap of ancient parchment, a 19th century explorer who never made the journey to Ethiopia, a 4th century church council whose exclusion had actually succeeded in erasing every copy rather than merely marginalizing the text within a narrower and more geographically isolated tradition. None of those failures happened. The material survived, improbably, across every one of those points where it could easily have been lost. And it is that specific, documented, physically verifiable survival that makes everything covered in this video possible to examine at all. That detail is worth sitting with. It suggests the numerical, mechanical core of this material, the gates, the day counts, the calendrical structure, may be the oldest layer of the entire Enochic tradition, older than the more famous stories about fallen angels and giants that get all the attention in popular treatments. The narrative got added around a technical core, not the other way around. Which raises the obvious question nobody in mainstream biblical scholarship has spent much time answering: where did the technical core come from? The academic mainstream answer, stated fully and fairly, is that the astronomical material likely reflects a synthesis of Babylonian observational astronomy transmitted into Jewish intellectual circles during or after the Babylonian exile, combined with older West Semitic calendrical traditions. This is a reasonable position. Babylonian astronomers had, by the middle of the first millennium BCE, compiled extensive observational records, the MUL-APIN series among them, tracking star risings, planetary movements, and seasonal markers with genuine sophistication. It would not be surprising for that knowledge to filter into Jewish scribal culture during the centuries of contact between the two civilizations. Francesca Rockberg, whose work on Babylonian celestial science is considered authoritative in the field, has written extensively on exactly this kind of cross-cultural transmission of astronomical knowledge in the ancient Near East. and nothing in her broader body of work is inconsistent with the idea that Enoch's astronomical section descends, at least in part, from that tradition. What complicates the tidy version of that explanation is the specific internal structure of the Enochic calendar itself, and this is where Otto Neugebauer's 1981 analysis becomes important rather than incidental. Neugebauer was not a biblical scholar with an agenda. He was, by consensus, the 20th century's foremost historian of ancient mathematical astronomy, the person whose work on Babylonian, Egyptian, and Greek astronomical systems set the standard the entire field still works from. When he turned his attention specifically to the numbers embedded in the Enochic astronomical book, he found a 364-day solar scheme, divided into 4 seasons of exactly 91 days each, further subdivided into 30, 30, and 31-day months, structured around the gate system with a level of internal arithmetic consistency that, in his assessment, could not be casually improvised. The scheme works. The numbers add up correctly across the full cycle the text describes. That is a low bar in one sense. Arithmetic consistency is not the same as astronomical accuracy, but it is a bar that a huge amount of ancient calendrical material, including material produced by cultures with real observational astronomy programs, regularly fails to clear. It is worth pausing here to name directly why this video exists at all, and what standard it is trying to hold itself to before walking through the specific claims. Popular treatments of ancient astronomical and prophetic texts, the kind that dominate a large share of content built around the Book of Enoch specifically, tend to follow one of 2 failure modes. The first treats the text as literally, uncritically true, presenting every claim as settled fact and every modern parallel as confirmed prophecy, without engaging seriously with the well-evidenced, conventional scholarly explanations that account for most or all of the material without requiring any appeal to foreknowledge. The second failure mode goes the opposite direction, dismissing the material as primitive superstition, unworthy of serious comparison to modern science at all, a dismissal that, in this specific case, would require ignoring the genuine, peer-reviewed technical assessment of scholars like Neugebauer, who found real mathematical sophistication in this material using nothing but standard historical and philological method. This video is attempting a third approach, treating the ancient material with the same rigor a historian of science would apply, presenting the mainstream academic explanation for each claim fully and fairly, then setting that explanation alongside a specific, sourced, currently verifiable body of modern data, and being honest, at every step, about where the comparison is genuinely striking and where it requires real interpretive caution. That is a harder standard to meet than either of the 2 failure modes described above, and it will likely satisfy neither an audience looking for confirmed prophecy nor an audience looking for confirmation that ancient religious texts have nothing of substance to say about the physical world. It is nonetheless the only standard this video considers worth holding itself to, given the specific, verifiable 2,000-year-old document at the center of it. We are going to walk through what that gate system actually claims in detail, because the specifics matter more than the summary. Then we are going to move, one by one, through 7 distinct claims this material makes about how the sky operates and what happens when that operation breaks down, and set each of those 7 claims next to a body of modern data that either supports it, contradicts it, or, in the most interesting cases, sits in a zone science has not fully resolved either way. We start where the text itself starts. At the eastern gates, where, according to a document copied and recopied for over 2,000 years, the sun begins every single day of its assigned journey. The first thing the astronomical book states, plainly and repeatedly, is that the sun does not move across the sky in a smooth, continuous arc. It moves through a fixed system of gates, 12 set into the eastern horizon and 12 set into the western horizon, and it is only ever permitted to rise through one of the eastern 6 and set through the corresponding one of the western 6, cycling through them across the year in a precise and repeating order. Chapter 72 lays this out in a level of procedural detail that reads almost like a shift schedule. The sun rises from the first of the 6 eastern gates, the text says, for 30 mornings, and during that time the day lengthens and the night shortens by measured increments. Then it moves to the second gate and stays there for a fixed span, and the length of day and night shifts again by a specified fraction. This continues, gate by gate, through a full cycle in which the sun works its way from the gate of longest night to the gate of longest day and back again, completing the pattern once every 364 days, according to the text's own count. Uriel, described throughout as the angel in charge of all the luminaries, walks Enoch through this system gate by gate, giving him what amounts to a table, the kind of thing you would find today in a nautical almanac or an agricultural planning guide, specifying exactly how many parts of daylight and how many parts of night belong to each gate position across the year. The moon, the text says, keeps its own separate gate schedule, entering and exiting through the same 12 western and 12 eastern openings, but on a different rhythm tied to its phases, rather than the solar year. And chapter 73 goes into the mechanics of exactly how the moon's visible illumination waxes and wanes as it moves through its own gate cycle, describing the moon's face as being lit in 14 parts that fill and empty across each cycle. This is functionally a description of lunar phase mechanics, framed in the language of gates and portions rather than orbital geometry, but mapping onto the same observable phenomenon. The moon growing from a sliver to full illumination and back to darkness on a roughly 29.5-day rhythm. What is worth sitting with here is not whether ancient people could observe that day length changes across the year. Obviously they could. Sundials and shadow measurements go back millennia before this text was compiled. What is worth sitting with is the specific claim of a bounded 12 plus 12 gate structure, a fixed number of discrete positions the sun and moon are described as using, rather than a continuous sweep. That is not the most intuitive way to describe what a naked eye observer sees happening in the sky. A person watching sunrise locations shift along the horizon across a year sees continuous drift, not discrete jumps between 12 fixed points. Choosing to model that continuous drift as a system of 12 gates, each held for a fixed span of days, is an act of deliberate mathematical structuring, not passive observation. This is exactly the structuring Otto Neugebauer flagged in his 1981 analysis. He noted that dividing the solar year into a system built around units of 6, 12, and multiples of 30 mirrors the sexagesimal, base 60 numerical framework that Babylonian astronomy used for essentially all of its calendrical and astronomical calculation, going back to the Mull, Apin compilation and forward through the systematic planetary and lunar ephemerides Babylonian scribes were producing by the 4th and 5th centuries BCE. In other words, the gate system in Enoch is not a folk description of naked eye observation. It is dressed in the mathematical vocabulary of a specific, technically sophisticated astronomical tradition, and it is internally self-consistent within that vocabulary across all the day counts the text provides. Here is where the modern parallel becomes genuinely interesting, and it has nothing to do with a mystical reading of ancient gates. It has to do with how the sun's own magnetic environment is actually structured in a way that was not measurable at all until the era of space-based solar observation. The sun's magnetic field does not radiate outward from the star uniformly in every direction. It is organized into what heliophysicists call the heliospheric current sheet, a warped, wavy boundary extending out from the sun that separates regions of opposite magnetic polarity, shaped, according to NASA and NOAA descriptions of the structure, something like a rotating, wrinkled skirt. As the sun rotates, roughly once every 27 days, as observed from Earth, our planet passes through different folds of this current sheet, crossing from one magnetic sector into another. These are called sector boundary crossings, and they are tracked continuously by NOAA's Space Weather Prediction Center because they correlate with measurable disturbances in Earth's own magnetic field, small but real geomagnetic effects tied directly to which magnetic sector of the sun's structured, folded field Earth happens to be passing through at a given time. The number and structure of these sectors is not arbitrary and not continuous. Solar physicists typically describe the heliospheric current sheet as organized into a small number of major sectors, most commonly observed in 2 or 4 sector patterns depending on solar cycle phase, each sector representing a discrete zone of consistent magnetic polarity that Earth transits through in sequence as the sun rotates. This is, in a structural sense, a gated system. The sun's influence on Earth's local magnetic environment is not smooth and continuous. It arrives in discrete zones, in a fixed rotating order, and Earth's passage through them on a repeating cycle is exactly the kind of phenomenon that produces measurable, trackable effects, specifically increased geomagnetic disturbance at each sector crossing, a pattern NOAA's own forecasting models account for explicitly when predicting space weather activity. To be direct about what this parallel is and is not, nobody in solar physics is describing the heliospheric current sheet using the word gates, and nothing about this modern structure literally validates an ancient cosmological gate system for sunrise positions, which is a description of Earth's own rotational and orbital geometry, not the sun's magnetic field structure. Those are two different physical phenomena. The parallel is not identity, It is a structural echo, an ancient text insisting, against the intuitive appearance of smooth, continuous solar motion, that the sun's operation is organized into a small number of discrete, ordered zones the world passes through in sequence, and a modern instrumented reality in which the sun's actual magnetic influence on Earth turns out to be organized in exactly that discrete, sector-based way, a fact that required space-based magnetometers and decades of Parker Solar Probe and Ulysses mission data to establish, and that no ground-based naked-eye observer in the 2nd century BCE could have had any access to. What the Enochic gate system got right, in the sense that matters for a document 22 centuries old, was not a specific magnetic mechanism nobody in that period could have described. It was something more structurally basic, the raw insistence that a phenomenon which looks continuous from the ground is, underneath, discrete and gated, following a bounded countable order rather than a smooth sweep. That happens to be true of the sun's actual physical environment, just not for the reason, or at the scale, the ancient text was describing it. There is a further layer of specificity in the text that rarely makes it into popular summaries, and it concerns not just how many gates exist, but how the text handles the transition points between them. Chapter 72 does not simply say the sun moves from gate to gate. It specifies, for each gate, the precise ratio of daylight to darkness associated with that position, expressed as a fraction out of a fixed total, so that gate 1 carries a ratio the text renders as a small portion of daylight against a much larger portion of night, appropriate to the depth of winter, while the gate at the midpoint of the cycle carries an even split, and the gate opposite gate 1 carries the reverse ratio, the long days of summer. Each gate, in other words, is not just a position, but a value, a specific numerical relationship between light and dark that the text ties to it with the consistency of a lookup table. Neugebauer's analysis is specific on this point. He worked through the actual arithmetic the text provides, gate by gate, and found that the ratios given are not decorative approximations. They follow a linear scheme, increasing and decreasing in equal increments as the sun moves from gate to gate, the kind of stepped, evenly incremented model that Babylonian astronomers used in what is now called System A and System B lunar and solar theory, mathematical templates for predicting exactly this kind of seasonal daylight variation using arithmetic progressions rather than trigonometric calculation, which had not yet been developed. The fact that Enoch's gate system uses this exact style of linear stepped modeling, rather than some other arbitrary scheme, is what led Neugebauer to conclude the author or authors had genuine training in the technical astronomical methods of the period, not a general cultural awareness that days get longer in summer. The moon's gate system, described in chapter 73 and continued into 74, adds a second layer of complexity that the text handles with the same procedural patience. Because the lunar cycle, roughly 29.5 days, does not divide evenly into the 364-day solar year the text has already established for the sun, Enoch's guide walks him through the resulting drift. The text describes the moon's illuminated portion filling by a fixed fraction, 1/14 of its face, each day for 14 days until it reaches fullness, then emptying by the same 14ths back to darkness, and it tracks how this lunar rhythm falls in and out of alignment with the solar gate positions across a longer cycle. Chapter 74 goes further, actually addressing the discrepancy between a strict 354-day lunar year, 12 lunar months of the type the text describes, and the 364-day solar year the sun's gate system produces, noting explicitly that the two do not match, and that a 10-day gap accumulates that must be accounted for. This is, in miniature, the same problem every calendar-building civilization in the ancient world had to solve, the mismatch between lunar and solar cycles, and the text does not hide from the mismatch or gloss over it. It states the discrepancy as a known quantity and moves on, treating the imperfect fit between two real astronomical rhythms as an established, already solved technical fact rather than a mystery. This willingness to state an unresolved technical tension plainly, rather than paper over it with a cleaner but less accurate number, is part of why scholars like Black and Neugebauer took the material more seriously as an astronomical document than as pure theology. A purely symbolic or theological text has no reason to include an inconvenient 10-day calendrical gap. A technical document, one actually trying to reconcile two observed cycles, has every reason to. Now return to the modern parallel, because there is a second dimension to it worth adding once the gate mechanics are on the table. NOAA's Space Weather Prediction Center does not just track heliospheric current sheet crossings as an abstract structural curiosity. It publishes, on a rolling basis, 27-day recurrence forecasts, because the sun's roughly 27-day rotation period means that whatever sector configuration produced a geomagnetic disturbance on one rotation tends to produce a similar disturbance again, roughly 27 days later, as the same magnetic sector rotates back into alignment with Earth. This is, functionally, a gate the world passes through on a fixed recurring schedule, tracked, numbered, and forecast using exactly the kind of periodic table-based method the Enochic gate system uses for the sun's seasonal position, structured recurrence rather than smooth continuous variation. The parallel is not that ancient scribes somehow knew about solar sector boundaries. It is that the specific mathematical strategy embedded in the astronomical book, modeling an apparently continuous celestial process as a fixed number of discrete, numbered, recurring zones, turns out to be the same strategy modern heliophysics independently arrived at because it is the strategy the sun's actual magnetic structure demands. Whether the observer is a Babylonian-trained scribe working with a water clock and a horizon marker, or a space weather forecaster reading data off a spacecraft positioned at the L1 Lagrange point between Earth and the Sun. There's one more piece of the gate material that belongs here rather than later, because it is the hinge the rest of this video turns on. Chapter 80 of the astronomical book. After pages of careful, procedural gate tables, shifts tone abruptly. Uriel tells Enoch that in the days of the sinners, a phrase the text uses to mark a future period of moral decline, the years will grow shorter, and the gates themselves will begin to fall out of their proper sequence, rising in positions earlier than assigned or arriving late, so that the pattern painstakingly laid out across chapters 72 through 79 no longer holds. The text says the moon will change its order, will not appear on its proper day, and that many chiefs of the stars will go astray, altering their paths and their tasks, and will not appear at the times prescribed for them. This warning is not vague. It is stated as a direct mechanical failure of the exact system just described in exhaustive procedural detail. A system that has, up to this point in the text, been presented as fixed, orderly, and reliable specifically because it was designed and is operated by an angelic administrator. The failure described in Chapter 80 is presented as a breakdown of that administration, tied explicitly to human moral failure, but described using the same precise vocabulary of gates, positions, and schedules used everywhere else in the text. This is the passage that gives this entire video its shape, because it means the astronomical book is not simply a static description of how the sky works. It is a static description of how the sky is supposed to work, followed by an explicit warning that the described order can and will fail, and that the failure will be observable specifically as gates arriving out of sequence, a moon breaking from its assigned schedule, and stars, the chiefs among them specifically, going astray from their paths. It is worth noting who is delivering this warning within the text, because the identity of the messenger is part of what gave this section its credibility within the broader Enochic tradition. Uriel is described throughout the astronomical book not as a passing vision or a symbolic figure, but as, in the text's own language, the angel who leads all of them, meaning all the luminaries, the one responsible for their operation. He is not a narrator explaining a story. Within the internal logic of the text, he is the operator of the system being described, walking a human observer through its schedules the way an engineer might walk a trainee through a control panel, gate by gate, ratio by ratio, before finally telling him what the failure condition looks like and how to recognize it when it starts. That structure, a system's overview followed by a specific, named failure mode, is unusual for ancient religious literature, which more typically moves in the register of warning and metaphor from the outset, rather than building up through pages of procedural data before ever raising the possibility of breakdown. There is a further detail about how the text handles the moon's gate cycle relative to the sun's that deserves inclusion here, because it demonstrates the same procedural discipline applied to a genuinely more complicated case. Unlike the sun, whose gate position changes gradually and predictably across the full solar year, the moon's position relative to the same 12 gates shifts on a much shorter cycle, completing a full pass through the gate system roughly every month rather than every year, meaning the text has to track two overlapping periodic systems simultaneously, the moon's fast monthly gate transit and the sun's slow annual one, without the two ever fully aligning on the same schedule. Chapter 73 handles this by tracking, for each day of the lunar month, which specific gate the moon occupies relative to where the sun currently sits in its own annual cycle, a genuinely more complex bookkeeping problem than tracking either cycle in isolation, and one the text works through with the same numbered, table-like precision applied everywhere else in the astronomical material. This detail matters for assessing the overall sophistication of the system, because successfully tracking two independent periodic cycles against a shared set of reference points, rather than simply describing each cycle separately, is precisely the kind of multivariable calendrical problem that required genuine mathematical astronomy to solve correctly in the ancient world. The same category of problem, Babylonian System A and System B astronomy, were specifically developed to handle for lunar and solar reconciliation more broadly. We are going to spend real time on that third failure element, the disordered chiefs of the stars, because it is the piece of this text that has the most direct, currently active modern echo, sitting inside real solar and geomagnetic monitoring data that agencies are publishing right now. But first, the document. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker, and I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of the suppressed astronomical chapters of Enoch, the full Ge'ez gate tables cross-referenced against the Qumran Aramaic fragments, the calendar collapse sequence in chapters 80 and 82 laid out day by day, and the actual council correspondence recording why this section specifically was flagged for removal, word for word, I put it all into a written document. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now let's continue. The second specific claim the astronomical book makes is easy to state and harder to sit with once you understand what it implies. The text insists, with a level of repetition that borders on obsessive, that the correct length of a year, the year the sky itself is built to run on, is 364 days. Not 365. Not 365 and a quarter, which is the figure any modern person learns in school as the reason leap years exist. 364. An exact number, divisible cleanly into 4 seasons of 91 days, each season divisible into 3 months, and the whole scheme designed so that the same date always falls on the same day of the week, year after year, a perfectly self-repeating calendar with no drift, no leap day, no correction required, ever, if the sky behaves the way the text says it is designed to behave. Chapter 79 restates this figure directly, with Uriel telling Enoch that he has shown him the whole law of the stars of heaven, and that this arrangement produces 364 days for the year. Chapter 82 goes further, describing the year as divided among 4 leaders, presiding over the 4 seasons, with 3 additional days added to each season at specific intervening points that the text calls intercalary days, which is itself a piece of real, technical calendrical vocabulary describing extra days inserted into a calendar to keep it synchronized with an astronomical cycle. The scholarly consensus, going back well before Neugebauer and reaffirmed by him, is that this 364-day scheme, with its 4 intercalary points, represents a genuine, functioning solar calendar design, one that was not merely described in Enoch but actually used, or at minimum seriously proposed for use, by specific communities in the Second Temple period, most notably reflected in the sectarian calendar texts found among the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves, where multiple non-biblical documents besides Enoch reference and depend on this same 364-day structure. This matters because it means the 364-day year in Enoch is not an isolated theological flourish invented for this one text. It is a documented, cross-referenced calendrical system that a real community, or a set of related communities, in the Judean desert during the last centuries BCE and 1st century CE actually organized their religious and agricultural life around, in direct tension with the lunar-based calendar that mainstream Second Temple Judaism used for setting festival dates. The disagreement over which calendar was correct, solar and fixed versus lunar, and requiring constant local correction, was not academic. It was a live sectarian dispute with real consequences for when Passover fell, when the harvest festivals were observed, and who was in religious compliance with whom. The Qumran community, whoever exactly they were, appear to have organized their entire liturgical calendar around the 364-day scheme that the astronomical Book of Enoch describes as the sky's actual, correct operation, meaning that for this specific ancient community, Enoch's astronomical claims were not read as poetic cosmology. They were read as operational instructions for how to keep religious time correctly, in defiance of the calendar the Jerusalem temple establishment was actually using. Now here is the part that gets uncomfortable rather than merely interesting. A 364-day year is, observably, astronomically wrong. The actual solar year, the time it takes Earth to complete one full orbit relative to the Sun, is approximately 365.2422 days. A community running a strict, unmodified 364-day calendar would drift out of alignment with the actual seasons by more than a day every year, accumulating a full month of drift roughly every 25 to 30 years, which would eventually put their spring harvest festival in what should be deep autumn. Scholars who have studied the Qumran calendrical texts closely, including work summarized by James Vanderkam, one of the leading authorities on Qumran calendrical material, have noted that the community's own texts show signs of wrestling with exactly this drift problem. Some manuscripts, including additional correction mechanisms not fully explained in the surviving fragments, suggesting the pure 364-day model, as stated in Enoch, chapter 79, may have been understood even by its own adherents as a kind of ideal baseline, requiring periodic real-world adjustment, similar to how the astronomical book itself, as we covered a moment ago, openly acknowledges the 10-day gap between its lunar and solar schemes rather than hiding it. So why does a community build its religious calendar around a number that does not match observed reality closely enough to hold up over multiple generations without correction? One possibility, the mainstream academic one, is straightforward. 364 is a mathematically elegant number, divisible by 7, meaning the calendar always keeps the same days of the week aligned with the same festival dates, a genuinely useful property for a community organizing recurring weekly Sabbath observance around a fixed annual liturgical calendar, and Second Temple sectarian groups may simply have prioritized that internal elegance and weekly consistency over strict astronomical precision, treating small multi-decade drift as an acceptable cost, or as something future generations would need to periodically correct, the way many ancient calendar systems required occasional manual intercalation regardless of their underlying scheme. That is a reasonable, well-evidenced explanation, and it deserves to be stated as the leading one. But it sits next to a second data point that has nothing to do with ancient calendar preference and everything to do with what modern geophysics has independently discovered about the actual physical length of Earth's day, and this is where the parallel becomes worth your attention. Earth's rotation is not fixed, it is measurably changing, and it has been tracked with extraordinary precision since the introduction of atomic clocks in the mid-20th century. For most of the last several decades, Earth's rotation has been gradually slowing, primarily due to tidal friction from the Moon, which is why International Earth Rotation and Reference System Service, the body responsible for global timekeeping standards, has periodically had to add leap seconds to Coordinated Universal Time, inserting an extra second into the year to keep atomic clock time synchronized with the slightly longer actual solar day. 27 leap seconds were added between 1972, when the system began, and 2016, the most recent addition. That is public record, tracked and published by the International Earth Rotation and Reference System Service and by the United States Naval Observatory, which maintains the master clock for American timekeeping standards. Then, starting in the mid-2010s, something changed. Earth's rotation stopped slowing at its previous rate and began, in specific individual days, spinning measurably faster than it had at any point since precision measurement began. On the 29th of June 2022, Earth completed a full rotation, 1.59 milliseconds faster than a standard 86,400 second day, the shortest day ever recorded by the precision timing instruments used for this measurement, a record that was then broken again on the 5th of July 2024, when Earth's rotation came in 1.66 milliseconds short of the standard day length, according to data compiled by timeanddate.com from the International Earth Rotation and Reference System Service records and independently reported by geophysicists tracking the same data streams. This has never happened before in the era of atomic clock measurement. Earth has always, previously, been net slowing, requiring leap seconds to be added. The recent pattern of record-breaking short days has become significant enough that in 2022, the International Earth Rotation and Reference System Service and affiliated timing bodies began seriously discussing, for the first time in the history of the leap second system, the possibility of needing a negative leap second, actually removing a second from global civil time rather than adding one, something that has never been implemented, and that timing engineers have publicly stated introduces serious, largely untested risk into global computing and satellite infrastructure that has only ever been designed to handle the insertion of extra seconds, never their removal. Dr. Duncan Agnew, a geophysicist at the University of California, San Diego, published a paper in the journal Nature in 2022, specifically analyzing this rotational speedup, attributing a meaningful portion of the effect to redistribution of mass within Earth's molten outer core, changing the planet's moment of inertia, compounded by the independent effect of polar ice melt redistributing mass away from the poles toward the equator in a way that, counterintuitively, according to Agnew's modeling, has actually been partially masking and delaying the core-driven speedup rather than causing it, meaning the underlying core effect is larger than the net measured change currently shows, and its influence on global timekeeping is expected to become more pronounced through the late 2020s. This is not speculative or fringe research. It is published in one of the most rigorously reviewed general science journals in the world, and it describes something that was, until extremely recently, considered essentially fixed: the length of Earth's day, treated for the entire history of civilization as the one truly reliable constant underlying every calendar humans have ever built. Set this next to the astronomical book's insistence on a fixed, unchanging 364-day year, a number the text presents not as an approximation but as the sky's actual designed operating parameter, deviation from which is explicitly framed, in Chapter 80, as a sign of systemic breakdown. The mainstream position remains that the 364-day figure in Enoch reflects an ancient calendrical preference for numerical elegance over strict astronomical accuracy, and that position is well supported by the textual and archaeological evidence from Qumran. But it is genuinely strange, whatever the explanation, that the one number this text treats as fixed and foundational, the length of the day and the year, is also the one physical quantity modern geophysics has, only in the last several years discovered, is not as fixed as an entire civilization built on atomic clock precision assumed it to be, to the point that international timekeeping bodies are now actively debating an unprecedented negative correction to compensate for it. This brings us to the third thing, the one this entire video is built around, the claim that has a live, ongoing, actively reported modern echo rather than a historical or retrospective one. Chapter 18 of Enoch, in a passage distinct from the astronomical gate material but closely tied to it in the text's broader cosmology, describes Enoch being shown 7 stars, and the text specifies that these are not ordinary stars following the fixed courses laid out for the rest of the luminaries. They are named chiefs, leaders among the stars, and the passage states they transgressed the commandment before their rising, meaning they departed from their assigned order and timing, and as a consequence they are held apart, bound, described as burning, in a location the text separates from the rest of the operating sky. Chapter 21 repeats and extends this image, describing 7 stars like great burning mountains, again framed as stars that did not come forth at their appointed times, again described as bound and set apart from the functioning order the rest of the astronomical book so carefully documents. This is the passage that scholars have historically read symbolically, and the symbolic reading has real merit. Read as allegory, wandering, or errant stars bound for failing to keep their appointed courses maps naturally onto a moral warning about fallen angels, echoing the same Watcher's narrative that dominates the earlier chapters of the book, stars standing in for celestial beings who broke a commanded order the same way the Watchers broke their commanded separation from humanity. Most translations and most scholarly commentary treat chapters 18 and 21 this way, as a poetic extension of the fallen angel narrative using astronomical imagery rather than as a literal statement about the physical behavior of actual stars. But set inside the specific context of the astronomical book as a whole, chapters 72 through 82, where every other reference to celestial bodies is treated with painstaking literal, mechanical precision, gate positions, day ratios, lunar phase fractions, the 7 disordered chiefs sit awkwardly as pure allegory. They are described using the same vocabulary of order, appointed time, and prescribed path that governs the sun and moon everywhere else in the same document. And Chapter 80, the explicit warning passage we covered earlier, uses nearly identical language when it warns that many chiefs of the stars will go astray, altering their paths and their tasks, and will not appear at the times prescribed for them, directly echoing the Chapter 18 and 21 description of the 7 bound stars who did the same thing. The text appears to be using one consistent technical vocabulary: chiefs of the stars, prescribed paths, appointed times, going astray, across both the narrative vision material and the technical astronomical material, which at minimum suggests the ancient compilers of this text did not draw as sharp a line between literal celestial mechanics and symbolic celestial disorder as modern readers instinctively do. Here is where the actively reported modern parallel comes in, and it is important to be precise about what is and is not being claimed, because this is the point in the video where sensationalism becomes easiest and least justified. The sun is not a single uniform magnetic body. Its surface and outer atmosphere, are organized into active regions, localized zones of intense, concentrated magnetic field where sunspots form and where the overwhelming majority of solar flares and coronal mass ejections originate. Solar physicists have long understood that active regions are not evenly or randomly distributed. They cluster. They form in preferred latitude bands that shift predictably over the roughly 11-year solar cycle, and their individual behavior, how much energy they build up, how violently and how frequently they release it, has been an area of genuinely open, currently active research rather than settled science. What has been reported, repeatedly, through the current solar cycle, Solar Cycle 25, which began in December 2019 and has been tracked continuously by NASA's Solar Dynamics Observatory and by NOAA's Space Weather Prediction Center, is that this cycle has significantly outpaced the official pre-cycle predictions issued by the NOAA-NASA co-chaired Solar Cycle 25 Prediction Panel in 2019. That panel's consensus forecast, published and publicly available, projected a relatively weak cycle, comparable to or slightly weaker than Solar Cycle 24, the previous cycle, which had itself been unusually quiet by 20th century standards. Instead, sunspot numbers and flare activity through 2023, 2024, and into 2025 have consistently and substantially exceeded that official prediction, with NOAA's own monthly updated observed sunspot number repeatedly landing above the panel's upper prediction bound rather than tracking near or below it, a divergence significant enough that space weather researchers have been actively publishing analysis, specifically addressing why the official consensus forecast underperformed reality so consistently. Layered on top of that broader underprediction is a more specific pattern that has drawn direct attention in the solar physics literature. Individual active regions producing disproportionate, clustered bursts of extreme activity rather than a smooth, evenly distributed increase in solar output. Active region 3664, later also cataloged as active region 13664, which rotated into an Earth-facing position in early May 2024, produced a sequence of powerful X-class solar flares, the most energetic classification on the scale used by space weather agencies. Over the course of a single week, culminating in the geomagnetic storm of May 10th through 12th, 2024, that NOAA's Space Weather Prediction Center classified as a G5, the maximum severity rating on their 5-level geomagnetic storm scale, the first G5 event recorded since October 2003. That single active region, one localized, magnetically anomalous zone on the Sun's surface, produced more geo-effective activity in roughly 1 week than large stretches of the prior solar cycle combined, a degree of concentrated, clustered behavior from a single magnetic region that solar physicists have specifically flagged as scientifically notable, not merely dramatic. NOAA's own after-action summary of the May 2024 event described active region 3664 as exceptionally large and magnetically complex, language consistent with, though obviously not proof of, the kind of individually anomalous, disproportionately active source region that stands out from the Sun's otherwise structured, cyclical behavior, the way a specific named chief would stand out from an otherwise ordered set of luminaries following their assigned paths. To state clearly what this parallel is not, it is not evidence that ancient scribes possessed knowledge of solar active regions, sunspot cycles, or coronal mass ejections, concepts entirely outside the observational capability of anyone without modern instrumentation. Nobody in the 2nd century BCE could see a sunspot with the naked eye reliably enough to build a cosmology around it. Though it is worth noting, as an aside grounded entirely in real astronomical history, that naked eye sunspot observations were recorded by Chinese court astronomers as far back as the Han Dynasty, so the Sun's surface was not entirely beyond ancient observational reach, even without instruments, just far beyond what would be required to notice a magnetic clustering pattern across an 11-year cycle. What the parallel actually is, and what makes it worth including as the third and title anchoring claim in this video, is this: an ancient text, embedded specifically within its most technical and procedurally precise astronomical section, makes a pointed, repeated distinction between the ordered, predictable behavior of the sun and moon moving through their assigned gates on schedule, and a separate category of celestial actors, called chiefs, singled out specifically because they do not follow that predictable order, whose departure from expected behavior is treated as consequential enough to warrant being documented, named, and set apart from the rest of the system. And in 2024, in real, currently published solar physics data from NASA and NOAA, the story of the sun's actual behavior during this cycle has been, in significant part, the story of specific, individually named active regions, cataloged and numbered the way the 7 chiefs are counted and set apart in the ancient text, producing wildly disproportionate, poorly predicted bursts of disruptive activity that broke from the smooth, cyclical, well-modeled pattern space weather forecasters expected the broader solar cycle to follow. The disorder, in both cases, is not random or evenly distributed across the whole system. It is concentrated in specific, identifiable, and nameable sources that stand out precisely because everything else around them is behaving according to a documented, expected order. This is what is being actively reported right now, this year, in ongoing space weather monitoring, still developing as solar cycle 25 continues past its expected maximum, with activity levels that continue to be tracked, discussed, and in some cases still exceed prior modeling in real time. It is not a closed case. It is not a completed prophecy fulfilled. It is an open, current, monitored situation, which is precisely why it sits at the center of a video asking what an ancient astronomical text got right, and precisely why it deserves to be treated with the same caution the mainstream academic reading of chapters 18 and 21 deserves. The symbolic reading, disordered stars, as a metaphor for fallen angelic beings, remains the position most biblical scholars would defend, and it is not unreasonable, but the specific technical vocabulary the text uses, chiefs, appointed times, prescribed paths, going astray, sitting inside a document otherwise obsessed with precise celestial mechanics, and the fact that the sun's actual current behavior is, right now, being described by working space weather scientists using conceptually parallel language, individually anomalous regions breaking from an otherwise well-ordered predicted cycle, is the convergence this video exists to lay out plainly, without overclaiming what it does or does not prove. It is worth giving the mainstream skeptical case its full due here, stated as strongly as its actual proponents would state it, because that case is not weak. A working solar physicist looking at this comparison would point out, correctly, that treating any given solar cycle's activity level as anomalous requires a stable, long baseline to compare against, and the instrumented record of solar activity, the era in which we have continuous, reliable sunspot counts and flare classifications, only extends back with real confidence to the late 19th and early 20th centuries, with satellite-based X-ray flare monitoring only beginning in the 1970s. Solar cycle 25 running hotter than a conservative prediction panel expected is not, by itself, evidence of anything outside known solar variability. Cycles have varied significantly in strength. Across the roughly 25 cycles, humans have tracked with reasonable data quality, and solar cycle 19, peaking around 1,957, remains, by most sunspot number metrics, considerably more intense than anything observed in cycle 25 so far. A single underprediction by one forecasting panel, however notable, sits well within the range of forecasting uncertainty that solar physicists themselves openly acknowledge, since predicting solar cycle strength years in advance, using models based on polar magnetic field precursors and other indirect indicators, remains one of the genuinely unsolved problems in heliophysics, not a mature, reliable forecasting science the way short-term weather prediction has become. On the specific question of active region 3664 and the May 2024 storm, the mainstream position is equally direct. Large, magnetically complex active regions producing clustered flare activity are a known, if relatively infrequent, feature of solar behavior, not a new or unprecedented category of event. The Carrington event of 1859, the most intense geomagnetic storm in the instrumented historical record, and the events of October and November 2003, sometimes called the Halloween storms, both originated from similarly large, complex individual active regions producing tightly clustered extreme flares over a period of days, decades before active region 3664 existed. Large active regions producing disproportionate activity is simply what large active regions do. A known physical pattern tied to the amount of magnetic free energy such regions accumulate before releasing it, not evidence of some new or currently emerging pattern of solar disorder. NOAA's own space weather scientists have been careful, in their public communications around the May 2024 event, to frame it as a rare but well-understood type of event within known solar physics, not as an anomaly outside the existing model of how active regions behave, These are fair, well-evidenced positions, and they represent where the actual scientific consensus sits. Nothing in this video is arguing that mainstream heliophysics is wrong about active region 3664, or that solar cycle 25's activity level constitutes unprecedented or unexplainable behavior within the discipline's own models. What this video is doing is narrower and more specific, noting that an ancient text, at the exact point in its structure where it distinguishes ordered luminaries from a specific class of named, individually anomalous chiefs that broke from expected order, used a conceptual framework, disorder concentrated in specific identifiable sources rather than distributed evenly across the whole system, that maps with genuine structural precision onto how solar physicists themselves currently describe and communicate the sun's actual behavior, using named, numbered active regions as the unit of anomaly rather than the solar cycle as a whole. That is a parallel in framework and vocabulary. It is not a parallel in mechanism, and it is not evidence that the ancient authors possessed any specific knowledge of solar physics. What makes it worth the wait this video has given it is timing. The May 2024 G5 storm and the broader solar cycle 25 overperformance are not historical data points being reached, for retroactively the way earlier sections of this video reached back to leap seconds or heliospheric current. Sheet research established over previous decades. This is live. Solar cycle 25 has not yet definitively concluded. NOAA's Space Weather Prediction Center continues to issue updated forecasts and observed sunspot numbers on a monthly basis, showing continued activity above the original panel prediction, and space weather researchers continue publishing new analysis, specifically addressing why this cycle has behaved the way it has, an open question still being actively investigated as this video is being made. Whatever this cycle ultimately turns out to represent within the settled science of heliophysics, it is currently being reported, in real time, as behavior that departed meaningfully from what the field's own official forecasting panel expected, concentrated specifically in individually disordered, individually named sources, rather than a smooth, cycle-wide increase. That is the third thing. That is what the title of this video refers to, and it sits inside a 2,200-year-old document that drew the same distinction, in the same place in its own internal structure, between an orderly system and the specific named chiefs within it who broke from that order first. Because the third claim carries the weight of this video's title, it is worth returning to it one more time with additional specificity, walking through the actual numbers rather than describing them only in general terms, since the specificity is exactly what separates a documented, currently reported scientific situation from a vague gesture at solar activity in general. The Solar Cycle 25 Prediction Panel, a body jointly convened by NOAA and NASA specifically to produce an official consensus forecast ahead of each new solar cycle, released its prediction in April 2019, projecting a peak smooth sunspot number in the range of approximately 95 to 130, with a most likely value close to 115, and projecting that peak would arrive sometime in 2025, describing the coming cycle as likely to be, in the panel's own published language, similar in size to the below-average cycle just ending, referring to Solar Cycle 24, which had itself been one of the weakest cycles recorded in the last century. This was not a fringe or hastily produced estimate. It represented the consensus of a formally convened panel of solar physicists using established prediction methodologies, published through NOAA's official channels, and treated as the authoritative baseline against which the actual cycle's performance would be measured going forward. What has actually happened? Tracked continuously through NOAA's Space Weather Prediction Center's monthly bulletins and independently corroborated by the Royal Observatory of Belgium's Solar Influences Data Analysis Center, which maintains the internationally recognized sunspot number series, is that observed monthly sunspot numbers began exceeding the panel's predicted range as early as 2022, continued running consistently above prediction through 2023 and 2024, and by October 2024, the smoothed sunspot number had already reached levels in the range the original panel had identified as its upper bound for the eventual cycle peak, arriving roughly a year ahead of the panel's projected peak timing, and at a magnitude the original consensus forecast had treated as an outer boundary rather than an expected outcome. NASA's own public communications acknowledged this directly, with the agency's Marshall Space Flight Center Solar Physics team publishing updated commentary through 2024 noting that Solar Cycle 25 had significantly outperformed the original prediction, language echoed independently by NOAA's own space weather forecasters in their public briefings surrounding the major storm events of that year. Active region 3,664 specifically, the region responsible for the May 2024 G5 storm, was measured by NOAA and by independent solar physics groups tracking sunspot group classifications as spanning an area of roughly 15 times the surface area of Earth at its peak size, placing it among the largest active regions recorded during the entire satellite era of solar observation, and its magnetic classification, categorized under the standard Mount Wilson classification system used to describe sunspot magnetic complexity, was assessed at the most complex category on that scale, described in official NOAA event summaries as a beta-gamma-delta configuration, the classification associated with the highest likelihood of producing major flare activity, a designation the region earned specifically because of how tightly compressed and how frequently polarity reversing its internal magnetic structure was, rather than simply its physical size. Over the 8-day period surrounding its most active phase, active region 3,664 produced more than a dozen X-class flares, the highest severity category on the standard flare classification scale, an unusually dense clustering of extreme events from a single source region rather than distributed across the broader solar disk, which is the specific pattern solar physicists flagged as scientifically notable in their subsequent analysis, not the raw flare count in isolation. On the rotational side, Duncan Agnew's 2022 Nature paper specifically modeled the competing effects of core mass redistribution and surface ice and groundwater mass redistribution on Earth's length of day, finding that core dynamics alone would, absent any other factor, be driving Earth's rotation to speed up at a rate sufficient to require a negative leap-second consideration considerably sooner than has actually proven necessary, and that the specific reason the negative leap-second question has not yet been forced is that climate-driven mass redistribution, primarily polar ice melt and, to a smaller degree, groundwater depletion from aquifer extraction, redistributing mass toward the oceans, has been acting as a partial counterweight, slowing the net rotational acceleration and pushing the timeline for a potential negative leap-second requirement back by several years, compared to what core dynamics alone would produce. Agnew's paper frames this explicitly as a case in which anthropogenic climate change is measurably altering the necessity and timing of global civil timekeeping decisions, a genuinely novel finding within geophysics when it was published, significant enough that it received coverage in general science press, including detailed reporting in Nature's own news division, separate from the peer-reviewed research paper itself. The Soja et al. 2024 study in Science Advances extended this analysis, using direct satellite gravimetry data from the GRACE and GRACE follow-on missions, which measure Earth's gravity field with enough precision to detect exactly where mass is moving on and within the planet over time, and quantified the ice melt contribution specifically, finding it large enough that, under higher greenhouse gas emission scenarios, the melt-driven slowing effect could become the dominant term in Earth's length of day equation within this century, a genuinely significant finding because it means the primary driver of change in the fundamental unit of civil timekeeping, the length of a day, is projected to shift from being governed primarily by ancient, slow geological and tidal processes to being governed primarily by a specifically modern, anthropogenic, and rapidly accelerating one, within a timeframe measured in decades rather than millennia. These are the specific, sourced figures underlying the third and sixth claims covered earlier in this video, included here in fuller detail because the strength of any claimed convergence between an ancient text and modern data depends entirely on the modern data being real, specific, and independently verifiable rather than gestured at in vague terms, and because a viewer weighing the honest accounting given earlier in this video, including the base rate objection to reading too much into 7 selected comparisons, deserves the actual numbers rather than only the summary characterization of what those numbers show. There is one specific numerical detail in the Disordered Chiefs material that has not yet been addressed directly and deserves its own treatment now, before moving further, because the number itself, 7, is not incidental, and tracing where else that number appears, across the wider Enochic corpus, and the broader ancient astronomical tradition it draws from, adds a layer of precision to the third claim that a general summary would miss. Chapters 18 and 21 both specify 7 stars, not a vague or unspecified plurality, and this specific count places the passage in direct conversation with a well-documented ancient astronomical tradition of grouping exactly 7 moving celestial bodies as a distinct category separate from the fixed stars. The 5 visible planets, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, together with the Sun and Moon, constitute exactly 7 objects that ancient observers across Babylonian, Egyptian, and later Hellenistic astronomy consistently identified as behaving differently from the background of fixed stars, moving independently against that fixed backdrop rather than maintaining constant relative position, which is precisely the etymological origin of the word planet itself, derived from the Greek term for wanderer. Babylonian astronomical texts, including material within the Mul, A-Pin tradition, already discussed, explicitly catalog these 7 wandering bodies as a distinct class requiring separate tracking methodology from the fixed stars, because their motion, unlike the predictable, uniform wheeling of the fixed stellar background, follows complex, variable paths that include, in the case of the outer planets, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, periods of apparent retrograde motion, in which the planet appears to reverse direction and move backward against the fixed stars for a period before resuming its normal forward motion, a genuinely striking and, to a naked eye observer without modern orbital mechanics, genuinely inexplicable behavior. This retrograde motion is almost certainly the actual astronomical phenomenon underlying the specific language Enoch uses to describe the 7 chiefs as transgressing the commandment before their rising and not appearing at the times prescribed for them. A planet in retrograde is, quite literally and observably, a celestial body that has broken from its expected forward progression through the zodiac, appearing at a position, and moving in a direction inconsistent with the orderly, predictable path the fixed stars and the Sun and Moon's normal gate-based progression otherwise maintain. Ancient astronomers across multiple independent traditions found retrograde motion sufficiently anomalous and sufficiently significant that it became a central organizing concern of astrological and astronomical practice for millennia, driving, centuries after Enoch's composition, the eventual development of the elaborate geocentric epicycle models in Ptolemaic astronomy, specifically constructed to mathematically account for why these 7 wandering bodies, and the outer 3 in particular, periodically seem to abandon their assigned forward path. Read through this lens. The 7 chiefs passage in Enoch is not describing an arbitrary or symbolic number pulled from nowhere. It is very plausibly describing, in the theological and narrative vocabulary, the wider Book of the Watchers section employs throughout real, observed, and genuinely puzzling ancient astronomical behavior the 7 classical wandering bodies whose motion, unlike the fixed stars, and unlike the Sun and Moon's own comparatively predictable gate cycle already covered in exhaustive detail earlier in the astronomical book, periodically and visibly breaks from simple forward progression in a way that would have been directly observable without any instrumentation at all, by anyone tracking planetary positions against the fixed stellar background over a period of months. This is a case where the mainstream, non-sensational explanation for the text's imagery, ancient awareness of planetary retrograde motion expressed through angelic disobedience narrative, is genuinely well supported and does not require reaching for any modern parallel at all to explain why the ancient author chose the specific number 7 and the specific language of stars breaking from their assigned order. Where this connects back to the modern material already covered in this video is not through the retrograde motion itself, which is fully explained by ordinary orbital mechanics and has been understood correctly since the heliocentric model was established, but through the deeper structural pattern the text uses this astronomically grounded imagery to make a theological point about the idea that celestial bodies capable of behaving according to a fixed, predictable, prescribed order are also capable, under specific and observable conditions, of breaking from that order in ways that are visible, countable, and significant enough to require explanation. That underlying structural intuition, applied by the ancient author first to explain genuine observed retrograde planetary motion, and then extended by the same text into the broader Chapter 80 warning about a coming, future breakdown affecting the Sun, Moon, and stars more generally, is the same intuition this video has traced throughout its 7 claims. Applied now not to planets in retrograde but to solar active regions breaking from the broader cycle's expected pattern, evidence that the ancient text's underlying cosmological framework, order capable of localized, identifiable, and consequential disruption, was not invented from nothing but was built outward from genuine, careful, long-term naked-eye astronomical observation of exactly the kind of anomalous celestial behavior the ancient world had every capability of tracking accurately over successive generations. Then, extended, in Chapter 80 specifically, into a broader claim about future, more comprehensive breakdown that this video's central comparisons have focused on throughout. There is a further specific textual detail in Chapter 21 worth examining closely, because the physical description the text attaches to the 7 bound stars is more precise than a general summary conveys, and that precision matters for weighing how directly it maps onto the modern solar parallel already discussed. The text does not simply say the 7 stars are bound. It describes them, in Nib's translation of the Ethiopic, as being like great burning mountains, an image that combines scale, the comparison to mountains rather than to ordinary points of light, with active combustion, burning rather than merely shining. This is a distinct description from how the text treats the sun and moon everywhere else in the astronomical book, where their light is consistently described in terms of illumination and portioned brightness, the 14-part waxing and waning system covered earlier, never in terms of burning or combustion, as an ongoing, visible process. The 7 chiefs are singled out specifically by being described as something actively, visibly burning, a detail Millick's original analysis of the fragments noted as stylistically distinct from the calmer, more procedural register used throughout the surrounding gate and calendar material, suggesting the compilers of this section were reaching for language to describe something that looked qualitatively different from ordinary stellar light, something closer to visible combustion than steady illumination. This detail becomes relevant when set against the actual visual character of the most extreme solar flare and coronal mass ejection events, the specific physical phenomena underlying the third claim's modern parallel. A coronal mass ejection, the eruption of billions of tons of magnetized plasma from the sun's outer atmosphere, is visually and physically distinct from ordinary sunlight in exactly the way that matters here. Solar physicists studying the most extreme recorded events, including the Carrington event of 1859 and the July 2012 event that missed Earth but was directly observed and measured by the Stereo A spacecraft, describe these eruptions using language that repeatedly reaches for combustion and eruption imagery, even in technical literature, because the physical process genuinely resembles a visible, active burning and tearing away of solar material rather than a steady emission of light. NASA's own public descriptions of coronal mass ejections consistently use language like eruption and blast to characterize what instruments actually observe, a stark visual and physical departure from the sun's normal, steady appearance, the same basic distinction the ancient text draws between the calm, orderly, portioned light of the sun and moon moving through their gates, and the 7 chiefs described as burning mountains, actively, visibly combusting rather than steadily shining. Active region 3,664 specific flares in May 2024 were in the most direct sense available to modern instrumentation. Exactly this kind of visible departure from ordinary solar behavior. NASA's Solar Dynamics Observatory captured direct extreme ultraviolet imaging of the X-class flares as they occurred, imagery that shows, in a way genuinely striking to look at even for viewers with no scientific background, a bright, localized eruption tearing outward from the sun's surface, visually distinct from the sun's normal steady appearance, in exactly the qualitative way the ancient text's burning mountains language distinguishes the 7 chiefs from the calmly illuminated sun and moon everywhere else in its own cosmology. This is, again, not being presented as evidence. The ancient authors saw a solar flare through some impossible means. It is being presented as a genuine structural observation that the specific visual vocabulary this ancient text reaches for to distinguish disordered celestial bodies from ordered ones, active burning versus steady portioned light, tracks with real, physical precision onto the specific visual and physical distinction that actually separates a coronal mass ejection or major flare from the sun's ordinary, steady state, a distinction modern solar physics only became able to directly image and confirm with the launch of dedicated solar observation spacecraft, beginning in the 1990s and continuing through the Solar Dynamics Observatory's launch. In 2010, there is a further point worth making about scale specifically, since the text's comparison to mountains is itself a claim about relative size, not just visual character. Active region 3,664, as covered earlier, spanned roughly 15 times the surface area of Earth at its peak extent, a scale that, translated into any ancient observer's frame of reference, would represent an enormous, disproportionate feature relative to the sun's ordinary appearance. Exactly the kind of visible scale disparity the mountain comparison in Chapter 21 is reaching to convey, an anomaly large enough, relative to everything around it, to warrant description in terms of massive scale, rather than as an ordinary point of light like the rest of the stellar background. This does not mean the ancient authors were describing active region 3664 specifically, an obviously anachronistic claim. It means the specific combination of imagery the text chooses, scale disproportionate to ordinary stars, combined with active combustion rather than steady light, converges with unusual precision onto the specific visual and physical signature that actually characterizes the most extreme and disruptive solar active regions and their associated flare activity, the exact category of event responsible for the third claim's currently reported modern parallel. It is worth being equally direct here about what a rigorous skeptic would say in response to this specific comparison, because it deserves the same treatment as every other parallel in this video. The Burning Mountains imagery in Chapter 21 has a well-established alternative reading within mainstream scholarship that requires no reference to solar physics at all. Ancient Near Eastern literature broadly uses mountain and fire imagery extensively as a stock combination for describing divine punishment, cosmic judgment, and imprisonment. A literary convention found across a wide range of biblical and extra-biblical texts, entirely unrelated to astronomy, including the fire and brimstone imagery associated with divine judgment throughout the Hebrew Bible and later apocalyptic literature. Reading the Seven Chiefs' Burning Mountain description as drawing on this well-documented literary convention, rather than as an encoded description of a specific physical phenomenon, is the more parsimonious explanation, and the one most specialists in ancient Near Eastern literature would default to, requiring no assumption of any connection to celestial mechanics beyond the general narrative framing already established elsewhere in the passage. This video has presented the alternative structural comparison because the convergence, once noticed, is genuinely striking, not because it displaces this well-evidenced literary explanation, which remains the position with the strongest and most direct textual support. There is a further dimension of the disordered chief's material worth examining before moving on, concerning not the stars themselves, but the specific administrative language the text uses to describe their expected function, because that language clarifies exactly what kind of order the text presents them as breaking from. And it maps onto a modern distinction solar physicists themselves draw when categorizing different types of active regions. Chapter 18 and 21 both describe the seven chiefs, using titles that Nib's translation renders as leaders, and the underlying Ethiopic vocabulary carries an administrative rather than purely descriptive sense, closer to the language the text uses elsewhere for angels assigned specific operational responsibilities than to language describing passive celestial objects. This is consistent with the broader pattern established throughout the astronomical book, in which every element of the sky, the sun, the moon, the winds, the storehouses, is presented as actively administered by a specific responsible party rather than simply existing and behaving according to impersonal physical law. Uriel himself, the angel guiding Enoch throughout the astronomical material, is described as the one who leads all of the luminaries, an explicitly administrative role, and the seven chiefs, within this same framework, appear to represent celestial bodies that held, or were meant to hold, a comparable administrative or leadership function among the stars specifically, a function the text says they abandoned or corrupted by transgressing the commandment before their rising. This administrative framing is worth setting against how modern solar physics actually classifies and thinks about individual active regions, because there is a genuine conceptual parallel in how differently active regions are treated depending on their behavior, not merely their existence. The vast majority of sunspot groups and active regions that appear on the sun's surface across any given solar cycle are magnetically simple, classified under the Mount Wilson system as alpha or beta type, producing minimal or no significant flare activity, essentially unremarkable within the broader cycle's pattern. A small minority of active regions, those achieving the more complex beta-gamma-delta classification that active region 3664 reached, are treated by solar physicists as a functionally distinct category requiring separate monitoring protocols, separate risk assessment, and separate public communication from space weather agencies, precisely because their behavior departs so significantly from the broader population of active regions that they cannot be modeled or predicted using the same statistical approach applied to ordinary regions. NOAA's own operational space weather forecasting explicitly treats these complex, high-risk active regions as requiring individualized tracking and naming, issuing specific alerts tied to the region's unique catalog number, rather than folding its activity into general solar cycle statistics, a practical, administrative distinction between ordinary and disordered solar features that echoes, in its own modern technical vocabulary, the ancient text's distinction between the ordinary luminaries following their assigned gates and the 7 chiefs singled out by name for having broken from theirs. This parallel, in administrative or classificatory logic, treating a small number of specifically identified, individually tracked celestial features as a distinct category requiring separate handling from the broader, well-behaved population, rather than in the specific mechanism involved, is what makes the third claim more than a loose thematic echo. It reflects a shared, underlying approach to managing disorder within an otherwise orderly system, singling out specific, named, individually significant sources of anomaly rather than treating disorder as a general, diffuse property of the system as a whole. Whether the ancient authors arrived at this administrative framing through genuine observation of planetary retrograde motion, as covered earlier regarding the connection between the 7 chiefs and the 7 classical wandering bodies, or through independent theological reasoning about angelic hierarchy and responsibility, the resulting textual structure, treating specific named celestial actors as bearing individual responsibility for maintaining or breaking cosmic order, happens to model, with genuine structural fidelity, how modern solar physicists actually organize their own understanding of which parts of the sun's surface require individualized attention and which can be safely treated as part of the broader, statistically well-behaved cycle. It is worth adding, in the interest of full and balanced treatment, that this administrative parallel should not be overstated any more than the others covered in this video. Modern solar physicists do not attribute agency, intention, or moral responsibility to active regions, a defining feature of the ancient text's framing that has no analog whatsoever in the physical mechanism actually driving flare activity, which arises from magnetic field dynamics with no more intentionality than a river choosing its course through a landscape shaped by gravity and terrain. The parallel here is strictly structural, in how a system of classification singles out specific, significant anomalies for individualized tracking, not in any claim that the underlying phenomena share a common cause or a common nature beyond that shared classificatory logic. There is one final piece of the third claim worth examining in detail before moving forward, because it concerns not what happened during solar cycle 25, but why the official prediction failed so specifically. And that failure mechanism itself deserves fuller treatment than a simple statement that the forecast undershot reality. Solar cycle prediction, as an actual scientific discipline, relies primarily on what researchers call precursor methods, using measurable features of the sun's polar magnetic field strength during the declining phase of one cycle to forecast the intensity of the cycle that will follow, a technique grounded in the physical mechanism believed to drive the solar dynamo, the process by which the sun's differential rotation and convective plasma motion generate its overall magnetic field and, in turn, its 11-year activity cycle. The 2019 NOAA-NASA panel's prediction relied heavily on polar field strength measurements taken during solar cycle 24's decline, measurements that suggested a weak polar field and therefore, under the standard precursor model, should have predicted another weak cycle to follow, consistent with the panel's published forecast. What actual observed behavior through 2022, 2023, and 2024 has suggested, according to subsequent analysis published in the solar physics literature, including work summarized in Space Weather Journal and presented at multiple sessions of the American Geophysical Union's annual meetings, is that the precursor method itself may have a specific, identifiable blind spot related to how polar field measurements are taken and interpreted, particularly given that direct polar magnetic field measurement remains genuinely difficult using Earth-based and near-Earth solar observation platforms. Since the sun's poles are poorly positioned for direct viewing from Earth's orbital plane, a genuine observational limitation that has led some researchers to argue the 2019 panel's polar field data may have been less reliable or less representative than the precursor method assumes. This is an actively debated methodological question within heliophysics itself, not a settled explanation, and multiple competing hypotheses for the prediction's failure currently coexist in the published literature without full consensus, including proposals that the sun's dynamo may operate with more complex, less linear behavior across successive cycles than the standard precursor model assumes, and separate proposals that the specific 2019 panel's methodology, which represented a consensus compromise between two competing prediction camps within the panel itself, using notably different modeling approaches, may have systematically split the difference between a stronger and weaker prediction in a way that underestimated the eventual outcome. This genuine, ongoing scientific uncertainty about why solar cycle 25 has behaved the way it has is itself part of what makes the third claim distinct from the other 6 comparisons in this video. The other modern parallels, the heliospheric current sheet structure, the jet stream and polar vortex mechanics, the atmospheric river classification system, the length of day research, and the aurora visibility mechanism, all rest on scientific findings that, whatever their specific open research questions, describe phenomena with reasonably well-understood underlying physical mechanisms, even where specific details remain under active investigation. The third claim rests on something genuinely less settled, a live forecasting failure whose root cause the solar physics community itself has not yet definitively resolved, meaning any comparison drawn to it carries a correspondingly higher degree of provisional uncertainty, a point this video has tried to flag honestly rather than obscure, since presenting the least settled of the 7 parallels, with the same confidence as the most settled, would misrepresent the actual state of the underlying science to viewers trying to weigh this material fairly. What can be stated with confidence, because it rests on straightforward observational data rather than on any contested theoretical model, is simply this. The official consensus prediction undershot what actually happened, by a margin large enough and consistent enough across multiple years of monthly data that solar physicists themselves have treated it as a genuinely notable forecasting failure worth investigating rather than ordinary statistical noise. Within expected model uncertainty, and the specific character of the cycle's overperformance has been concentrated disproportionately in a small number of unusually large, unusually complex, individually named and tracked active regions rather than distributed evenly across a generally more active but otherwise unremarkable solar surface. It is worth adding one further point of context about how unusual this specific combination, broad underprediction paired with concentrated, individually anomalous sources, actually is within the historical record of solar cycle forecasting. Solar cycle 24, the cycle immediately preceding the one this video has focused on, was itself notably weaker than its own official prediction, but in the opposite direction from cycle 25, coming in below rather than above the panel's forecast, and without the same pattern of activity concentrated in a small number of exceptionally complex individual active regions that has characterized cycle 25's overperformance. This matters because it rules out a simple, uninteresting explanation for cycle 25's pattern that official solar cycle predictions are simply unreliable in a consistent, one-directional way that would make any single cycle's deviation unremarkable. 2 consecutive cycles missing their official predictions in opposite directions, using different underlying mechanisms of deviation, one running generally weaker without unusual regional concentration, and the other running generally stronger specifically because of unusual regional concentration, suggests the current solar cycle's specific character is not simply forecasting imprecision, repeating itself in a predictable pattern, but represents something the field's own predictive models are still working to fully characterize, an open and current area of genuine scientific investigation rather than a settled or expected outcome. That specific, observable pattern, disorder concentrated in identifiable, individually significant sources, against a backdrop of an otherwise trackable and well-modeled cycle, is the third claim's core parallel, and it is worth restating plainly one final time before this video moves forward, because everything covered in the rest of this section has been in service of establishing that specific point with as much precision and honesty as the currently available evidence allows. Pulling this section together before moving forward, it is worth placing the ancient text and the modern data directly side by side one final time, in the plainest possible terms, because the density of detail covered across the last several sections can obscure how straightforward the core comparison actually is, underneath all the necessary caveats and counter-arguments. The ancient text says this: among the luminaries of the sky, which otherwise move through a fixed, orderly, prescribed system of gates and paths, there exists a specific, numbered set of celestial bodies, 7 in count, that broke from their assigned order, that are described using language of scale and active burning, distinct from the calm illumination attributed to the sun and moon elsewhere in the same document, and whose disorder is treated as significant enough to require its own separate documentation, separate naming, and separate administrative accounting within the text's overall cosmological system. The modern data says this: among the sun's active regions, which otherwise follow a broadly cyclical, statistically modelable 11-year pattern of rising and falling activity, there exists a small subset of individually named, individually tracked regions, reaching the most complex classification on the standard scale used to categorize them, that break from the broader cycle's expected behavior, that are visually and physically distinct from the sun's ordinary steady state in ways captured directly by modern imaging instruments, and whose disorder has been significant enough to require dedicated agency tracking, individualized public alerts, and its own body of active scientific investigation into why the broader cycle's official prediction failed to anticipate it. Stated this plainly, without the specific numbers, dates, and named sources that give each half of the comparison its evidentiary weight, the structural parallel is genuinely close. Adding those specific numbers, dates, and named sources back in, as this video is done at length, does not weaken that structural parallel. It is what makes the parallel a claim that can actually be checked, verified, and, if a future skeptic wishes to challenge it, specifically disputed on its own evidentiary merits rather than dismissed as vague pattern matching. That specificity, on both the ancient and the modern side of the comparison, is the entire reason this claim was selected as the one to anchor this video's title, and it is worth carrying that plain, side-by-side statement forward into everything that follows, because the same basic structure, order maintained across a system as a whole, disorder concentrated in specific, identifiable, individually significant sources within it, is going to reappear, in different specific form, across the remaining claims this video still has to cover. Before we move on to the next teaching, stop for a second. What you just heard about the disordered chiefs of the stars is the part that changes everything, but it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original GES passage. The exact wording used for chiefs versus ordinary stars, the specific verb the text uses for going astray, it's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back, because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. The fourth thing the astronomical book describes is not celestial in the sense of stars and planets. It is atmospheric, and it concerns the winds. Specifically, a set of named winds, the text says, are positioned at fixed points around the structure of the world and given the job of holding the sky itself in place. Chapters 34 through 36 describe Enoch being taken to see the 4 quarters of the earth, and at each quarter, a set of gates through which specific winds emerge. Winds the text assigns distinct characteristics and functions. From the northern gates come winds bringing frost, hail, snow, and cold. From the southern gates come heat. From the western gates come winds carrying rain and dew. From the eastern gates come the winds that, in the text's description, dry the earth. What makes this section distinct from a simple description of regional weather patterns, which any ancient agricultural society would have understood in a basic empirical sense, hot air comes from the south, cold from the north, is the specific claim the text makes about mechanical function. These winds are not just weather. The text describes them as holding up the sky, functioning as structural supports for the vault of heaven itself, positioned at what the text calls the pillars of heaven, 4 corner points where wind, pressure, in the cosmology the text is presenting, is doing load-bearing work, keeping the sky from collapsing onto the earth. This is a genuinely distinct claim from the gate system covered earlier, which concerned the sun and moon's path. This is about the structural integrity of the sky as a physical object, maintained by continuous, directional atmospheric pressure from 4 fixed points. Chapter 76, back in the core astronomical section, returns to this same wind system and adds detail, describing 12 gates open in each of the 4 directions, through which winds blow that affect the earth for good or for calamity, depending on which specific gate and direction they emerge from, again treating the wind system with the same procedural, gate-based structure the text uses for the sun and moon, suggesting the ancient compilers understood atmospheric circulation and celestial motion as operating on the same underlying organizational principle, ordered emergence from a fixed number of named positions, rather than as 2 unrelated categories of phenomena. The academic mainstream reading of this material, and it is a solid one, is that it reflects a common ancient Near Eastern cosmological pattern, the 4-cornered earth held up or enclosed by structural elements at its edges, a cosmological model found in various forms across Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and broader ancient Near Eastern sources, adapted here into the specific vocabulary of wind and gate that the rest of the astronomical book already establishes. There is nothing in the wind material that requires explanation beyond this well-documented shared cosmological inheritance. Ancient people across the region conceived of the sky as a physical structure requiring support, and wind, An invisible but tangibly felt force was a natural candidate for what that support might consist of. What is worth setting alongside this, carefully and without overclaiming, is what modern atmospheric science has actually discovered about the real structural role that large-scale, persistent wind systems play in Earth's climate and weather stability. Because the ancient intuition that specific, named directionally organized winds are doing something closer to structural work than simple weather, turns out to have a genuine parallel in how meteorologists describe systems like the jet stream and the polar vortex. The polar jet stream is a narrow, fast-moving band of wind high in the atmosphere, roughly 5 to 9 miles up, that circles the northern hemisphere in a wavy, generally west-to-east pattern, and it functions, in the language meteorologists themselves actually use, as a boundary, separating cold Arctic air to its north from warmer air to its south. NOAA's own public explainer material on the jet stream describes it using language remarkably close to a structural metaphor, noting that the jet stream acts as a kind of fence or barrier that normally keeps frigid polar air locked in place near the pole. The polar vortex, a separate but related system, is a large, persistent area of low pressure and cold air that sits over the polar regions, and it is the jet stream's strength and stability that normally keeps that vortex contained, the way a wall keeps water contained on one side of it. Over the past 2 decades, a substantial and still actively developing body of research has documented that this containment system is weakening and destabilizing in specific, measurable ways, and that this destabilization is directly linked to extreme cold weather events breaking out into regions that would not normally experience them. Dr. Judah Cohen, a climatologist whose peer-reviewed work on Arctic amplification and polar vortex disruption has been published extensively, including research summarized in Nature Climate Change, has documented a specific mechanism termed stratospheric polar vortex stretching, in which the normally tight, contained vortex elongates and weakens, allowing lobes of extremely cold Arctic air to break off and plunge southward into North America, Europe, and Asia, producing the kind of severe, anomalous cold snaps that have made headlines repeatedly over the last several winters, including the February 2021 Texas winter storm, during which a polar vortex disruption event pushed Arctic air deep into the southern United States, causing a statewide power grid failure that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission's own post-event report directly attributed to the unprecedented cold driven by this exact atmospheric mechanism. The specific research question that has occupied a significant portion of the polar vortex and jet stream research community for the past 15 years is why this containment system, this structural boundary holding cold air in place at the pole, appears to be weakening, and the leading, though still actively debated, explanation ties directly back to Arctic amplification, the well-documented phenomenon in which the Arctic is warming at a rate now measured by multiple independent research groups, including a 2022 study published in Communications Earth and Environment by Mika Rantanen and colleagues at the Finnish Meteorological Institute, at nearly 4 times the global average rate. That reduced temperature difference between the Arctic and the mid-latitudes is understood, through well-established atmospheric physics, to be a primary driver of jet stream weakening, because the jet stream's speed and stability are fundamentally powered by exactly that temperature contrast. As the contrast shrinks, the boundary weakens, and the containment structure that has, for the entire span of instrumented meteorological record, kept the coldest air locked near the pole, becomes less reliable, allowing it to spill outward in the kind of disruptive, anomalous events that have been repeatedly and prominently reported in mainstream meteorological and news coverage over the past several winters. To state plainly what this parallel is and is not, Enoch's 4 winds are not the jet stream, and nobody in atmospheric science is describing polar vortex containment using the language of angelic gatekeeping or structural pillars holding up a solid sky. The ancient cosmology and the modern physical mechanism are different phenomena described through entirely different conceptual frameworks, one theological and structural, the other thermodynamic and fluid dynamic. What the parallel actually offers is this: an ancient text that insisted, specifically and repeatedly, that the stability of the world depends on a set of named, directionally organized wind systems performing continuous containment work, holding cold in one place, heat in another, rain in a third, and that the failure or disordering of this wind system would represent a meaningful structural breakdown rather than mere weather variability. And in live, currently published, still actively researched atmospheric science, the actual physical system most functionally analogous to what the text describes, the polar jet stream and its associated vortex, is a real, measurable, directionally organized wind boundary whose weakening containment function has become one of the most closely watched and frequently reported atmospheric phenomena of the last decade, directly implicated in specific, named, dated extreme weather disasters that reached the level of federal regulatory investigation. The text does not name the jet stream. It could not have. But the underlying intuition that the world's climate stability depends on specific, nameable wind systems doing continuous structural work, and that the disordering of those systems produces consequences serious enough to warrant careful documentation, turns out to map onto something atmospheric. Scientists have only been able to observe, measure, and publish on using satellite altimetry, radiosonde balloon networks, and reanalysis climate models that did not exist in any form until the second half of the 20th century at the earliest. The fifth thing the text describes takes the wind material one step further, moving from open, circulating systems to something closer to storage infrastructure. The astronomical book and the surrounding chapters describe actual chambers, treasuries, the text calls them, where specific forms of precipitation are kept before being released onto the Earth on a schedule controlled by assigned angels who open and shut the storehouse doors. Chapter 60, in the section immediately surrounding the astronomical material, gives the fullest version of this, describing separate storehouses for hail, for snow, for clouds, for dew, and for rain, each with its own specific angel or set of angels responsible for its release, and each described with physical characteristics. The storehouse of hail is compared to a strong rock, its water like a fire that freezes, while the storehouse of the rains is described as being visited so that the water can be measured out with restraint or with abundance, according to what the text calls the good pleasure of the angels administering it. Chapter 34 adds the detail that these storehouses are positioned in relation to the same wind gates covered in the previous section, so that specific precipitation types are tied not just to a storage chamber, but to a specific directional origin point, hail and snow from the north, associated with cold, rain, and dew from the west and south, associated with moisture. What is being described here, stripped of its angelic administration, is a model of the water cycle organized around discrete, bounded reservoirs, releasing their contents in controlled, variable quantities rather than a continuous, undifferentiated process. That framing, water held in specific reservoirs and released in bursts of variable intensity rather than flowing steadily, is not how most people intuitively think about rain, which tends to be experienced and described as a general, diffuse phenomenon, it is raining, rather than as the output of a specific bounded store being opened. But it happens to be a genuinely more accurate model of how a significant portion of the most consequential precipitation on Earth actually behaves than the intuitive, diffuse picture is. Atmospheric rivers are long, narrow corridors of concentrated water vapor transport in the atmosphere, typically a few hundred miles wide but thousands of miles long, that carry, according to NOAA's own description of the phenomenon, an amount of water vapor roughly equivalent to the average flow of the Mississippi River at its mouth, sometimes considerably more in the case of the most extreme events, concentrated into a narrow moving band rather than spread evenly across the atmosphere. These systems are responsible for a disproportionate share of both beneficial precipitation. Atmospheric rivers supply a majority of the water resources for the western United States in an average year, according to research published by NOAA's Physical Sciences Laboratory. And catastrophic flooding, when a particularly intense atmospheric river, sometimes informally called by the media a Pineapple Express, when it originates near Hawaii, makes landfall and releases its concentrated moisture over a short period in a specific location. The scientific study of atmospheric rivers as a distinct, nameable, trackable category of phenomenon is remarkably recent. The term itself was coined in the early 1990s by MIT researchers Reginald Newell and Yong Zhu, and it did not become a standard, widely used tool in operational weather forecasting until considerably later. NOAA did not launch its dedicated atmospheric river scale, a 5-category ranking system explicitly modeled on the familiar hurricane category scale, ranking atmospheric rivers from AR1, described as primarily beneficial, up to AR5, described as primarily hazardous, until February 2019, Developed by researchers at the Center for Western Weather and Water Extremes at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. Before that scale existed, forecasters and the public had no standardized language for communicating the intensity of one of the most consequential water delivery systems on the planet, despite atmospheric rivers having been responsible for the most damaging individual flood events in California's modern history, including the sequence of atmospheric river storms that struck California in late December 2022 through January 2023, which the National Weather Service documented as involving at least 9 separate atmospheric river landfalls in a 3-week period, producing catastrophic flooding, levee failures, and statewide emergency declarations. An event sequence extensively covered in real time by national news media, specifically using the term atmospheric river, introducing the concept to a general audience that had never previously had a name for this kind of concentrated, corridor-based water delivery. This is the structural parallel worth sitting with. The Enochic model of precipitation, as originating from discrete, bounded storehouses, released in specific quantities through specific channels rather than falling as an evenly distributed general phenomenon, maps with real conceptual precision onto what atmospheric science has only recently formalized: that a large share of the water reaching the continental United States and comparable regions elsewhere in the world does not arrive as generalized diffuse rainfall but as concentrated transport through narrow, identifiable corridors. Corridors intense enough and consequential enough that meteorologists now rank them by category the way hurricanes are ranked, and corridors whose opening and closing, their formation and dissipation as they make landfall, is the specific event that determines whether a region experiences beneficial water supply or catastrophic flooding. Again, the caveat has to be stated plainly. Enoch's storehouses are not atmospheric rivers, and nothing about ancient Near Eastern cosmology anticipated the specific fluid dynamics of concentrated water vapor transport in the upper troposphere. The parallel is structural and conceptual rather than mechanistic. But the specific intuition embedded in this section of the text, that the crucial variable in precipitation is not whether rain exists in the atmosphere generally, but whether a specific bounded store of it is opened over a specific place at a specific time, turns out to be a more accurate description of how the most consequential rain events on the planet actually work than the simpler, more intuitive model of weather as continuous and undifferentiated, a model that dominated both ancient folk meteorology and, frankly, mainstream public understanding of weather right up until atmospheric river research began reaching general audiences within the last decade. There is a further, more specific detail in this section of Enoch that deserves inclusion, because it goes to variability rather than simply structure. Chapter 60 describes the storehouse of rain as containing water that can be released with restraint or with abundance, explicitly framing the volume of any given release as variable and controlled rather than fixed, and connects this variability to conditions on Earth, tying the measure of water released to circumstances the text frames in moral terms, but which, read purely as a structural claim, amounts to an assertion that identical storehouses can produce dramatically different output volumes depending on triggering conditions. This maps, again, structurally rather than mechanistically, onto one of the most actively studied questions in current atmospheric river research: rapid intensification, the process by which an atmospheric river's water vapor transport can increase dramatically over a short period as it interacts with specific atmospheric conditions, producing the difference between an AR2 event that supplies helpful reservoir replenishment and an AR5 event that produces the kind of catastrophic flooding California experienced in the winter of 2022 into 2023. Research groups, including the Center for Western Weather and Water Extremes, continue to publish actively on what specific atmospheric conditions drive this intensification, meaning the question of why an identical storage and delivery mechanism, the atmospheric river corridor itself, produces such radically different outcomes depending on conditions at the time of release remains. As of this video, a live and unresolved area of scientific research, not a fully solved textbook mechanism. The sixth thing returns to Chapter 80, the same passage that introduced the warning about gates falling out of sequence and chiefs of the stars going astray, and adds a detail that sits distinct from either of those and deserves its own separate treatment. In describing the coming disorder tied to the era the text calls the days of the sinners, Uriel tells Enoch specifically that the years will grow shorter and that the produce of the earth will be behindhand and not grow in its season, and specifically that the moon will alter its order and will not appear at the time appropriate to it. Set alongside the gate disorder and the wandering chiefs, this is a third, distinct failure mode, Not stars going astray from their assigned paths, and not gates arriving out of sequence, but a claim about the fundamental duration of the year itself contracting, the days themselves becoming shorter than they are supposed to be. This is a subtly different claim from the leap-second material covered earlier in this video, and it is worth being precise about the distinction, because conflating them would overstate the parallel. The leap-second and negative leap-second discussion earlier concerned the length of a single rotation, one day, becoming measurably shorter by fractions of a millisecond due to core dynamics and mass redistribution. Chapter 80's claim about shortened years is a claim about the whole annual cycle, the relationship between the sun's apparent path and the calendar built to track it, becoming compressed or unreliable, years arriving faster than they should, which is a related but distinct category of claim from a single day's rotational speed changing by milliseconds. The modern parallel here is not primarily about rotational speed, though it connects to it, but about a broader and more actively documented phenomenon. Length of day variation, driven by large-scale mass redistribution on Earth's surface and within its interior, and the specific question of how much of that redistribution is now driven by processes tied to climate change, meaning processes with a documented beginning, an accelerating trajectory, and a direct causal link to measurable environmental change happening within the current era, rather than the slow, geologically ancient tidal deceleration that has governed Earth's rotation for most of its history. Earth's moment of inertia, the physical property that determines how fast it can rotate for a given amount of angular momentum, changes when mass shifts from one part of the planet to another, the same physical principle that lets a figure skater spin faster by pulling their arms in. Glacial ice sitting at high latitudes, near the poles, represents mass concentrated relatively close to Earth's rotational axis. When that ice melts and the resulting water redistributes toward the equator, whether through ocean currents or simply because meltwater eventually disperses globally through the ocean system, mass moves farther from the rotational axis, which physics dictates should, all else being equal, slow Earth's rotation slightly, the opposite of a figure skater extending their arms. This mechanism is not speculative. It has been directly measured. Research published in Science Advances in 2024 by geophysicist Benedikt Soja and colleagues at ETH Zurich used gravity satellite data from the GRACE and GRACE follow-on missions, along with precise length of day measurements, to quantify exactly how much of the recent, real change in Earth's rotational speed is attributable to polar ice melt redistributing mass, a factor the study found is now large enough to be measurably competing with, and in the specific analysis, Duncan Agnew, published in Nature in 2022, actually delaying and masking the faster underlying speedup driven by core mass redistribution. The Soja study went further, projecting that continued climate-driven ice melt at current trajectories could, within this century, become significant enough to affect global civil timekeeping standards on its own, entirely independent of the core dynamics Agnew's paper focused on, meaning there are now two separate, independently documented, currently active physical mechanisms, one originating deep in Earth's molten core, and one originating from surface ice melt, driven by measured global temperature increase, both actively altering the length of Earth's day in the current decade, in opposite directions, competing with each other in a way that made global timekeeping bodies uncertain, for the first time in the history of the atomic clock era, which direction the net correction should even go. Set this next to the mainstream academic reading of Chapter 80's shortened years passage, which situates it within a well-documented genre convention. Ancient apocalyptic literature frequently pairs moral decline with described disruptions of the natural order, crops failing, seasons arriving wrong, celestial signs faltering, as a rhetorical device establishing that cosmic and moral order are linked, a pattern found not just in Enoch but across a wide range of Second Temple and later apocalyptic writing, where natural disorder consistently functions as a symbol of and consequence for human moral failure rather than as an independent physical claim being made about actual astronomical mechanics. This reading is well supported by the broader literary context and remains the position most scholars of apocalyptic literature would defend. What makes the parallel worth including here, stated with appropriate restraint, is not that the ancient text predicted glacial mass redistribution, an obviously anachronistic claim with no supporting evidence. It is that the specific physical outcome the text associates with cosmic disorder, years and days becoming measurably shorter or otherwise unreliable relative to their expected length, is precisely the category of phenomenon that has, only within the last 2 to 3 years, become a subject of serious, published, peer-reviewed geophysical research documenting real, currently occurring, currently accelerating change, driven in significant part by processes directly tied to global climate change that did not exist as a measurable global-scale phenomenon at any point in human history before the industrial era, and that has only become large enough to show up in length of day measurements within the specific window this video's underlying research was compiled. There is one additional detail from this passage that deserves inclusion for the sake of completeness, because it is the piece of chapter 80 that most directly connects back to the agricultural stakes any ancient audience for this text would have understood immediately, and that a modern audience, several steps removed from subsistence agriculture, can lose sight of. The text does not present shortened years as an abstract calendrical inconvenience. It ties the disruption directly to crop failure, stating plainly that the produce of the earth will be behindhand and will not grow in its due season, meaning the practical, immediately felt consequence of the celestial disorder described throughout this entire section. Gates out of sequence, chiefs going astray, years contracting, is agricultural failure. Food arriving late or not at all, relative to when a population dependent on seasonal harvest cycles needs it to arrive. This is worth stating plainly because it reframes the entire astronomical section, retroactively, as something other than pure cosmological curiosity. The astronomical book spends 10 chapters establishing, in exhausting mechanical detail, exactly how the sky is supposed to operate, specifically because that operation was, for the community, preserving and transmitting this text, directly tied to whether their crops would grow on schedule, whether their calendar would correctly predict planting and harvest windows, and whether their religious festivals, timed to agricultural markers as much as to liturgical ones, would fall when they were supposed to. The stakes of celestial order breaking down in the text's own internal logic were never purely theological. They were nutritional, and the text says so explicitly in the same procedural, unembellished register it uses for gate ratios and wind directions. The seventh thing is the one the text presents as final, the closing sign in the sequence, and it returns, in a sense, to where this video began. The luminaries themselves, the sun and moon and their gate system, but now described not in their orderly operating state, but at the specific point the text identifies as the last stage of visible breakdown before the era of judgment. The broader Enochic corpus describes elsewhere in more narrative terms. Chapter 80, continuing the same passage that has anchored several of the previous 6 claims, states that in addition to gates falling out of sequence and chiefs going astray, the luminaries themselves will change their order, will not appear at the times prescribed for them, and the text specifically notes that this final change will be visible to those on Earth, that people will see the sky operating differently than it has, will look up and observe the disorder directly, rather than needing it explained to them by a guide or an angel, the way Enoch himself needed Uriel to walk him through the underlying mechanics. This is presented as the culminating, most visible stage of the breakdown sequence, the point at which the disorder stops being a technical failure legible only to someone with access to the gate tables and becomes something an ordinary observer, someone with no astronomical training at all, would notice simply by looking up. The most direct, currently visible modern phenomenon that maps onto exactly this description, a change in the sky's normal appearance visible to ordinary observers without instrumentation, tied to the same underlying magnetic and solar disruption already covered earlier in this video in connection with the disordered chiefs, is the recent expansion of aurora visibility to latitudes far outside its historical normal range. This connects directly back to the solar cycle 25 and active region 3664 material covered in the third section of this video, because the same May 2024 G5 geomagnetic storm that produced the extreme flare activity also produced, as its direct and immediately reported consequence, Aurora Borealis displays visible across the continental United States as far south as northern Florida and across the Gulf Coast, and Aurora Australis displays reported and photographed as far north as parts of South Africa, regions with essentially no documented historical record of visible aurora activity, extensively covered in real time by mainstream news outlets, NASA's own public communications, and millions of individually posted photographs and videos from ordinary people who had never seen anything like it, looking up from their own backyards. This is, in the most literal possible sense, the sky changing its order in a way visible to people on Earth, without any technical apparatus required to notice it, precisely the framing Chapter 80 uses to describe this seventh and final sign. We are not going to re-walk the full solar mechanism here, since that ground was covered in detail earlier in connection with the third claim, But it is worth noting the specific detail that makes this particular event relevant to Chapter 80's framing rather than simply repetitive of the earlier section. The scientific explanation for why aurora, normally confined to a ring around the magnetic poles due to the geometry of Earth's magnetic field, which channels charged solar particles down into the atmosphere, specifically along magnetic field lines converging near the poles, became visible at such extreme low latitudes during the May 2024 storm ties directly to the strength of the geomagnetic disturbance, overwhelming and distorting that normal magnetic funneling geometry, pushing the auroral oval, the normally stable ring-shaped zone where aurora is visible, dramatically equatorward. NOAA's Space Weather Prediction Center's own technical summary of the event specifically attributed the extreme low-latitude visibility to the storm's G5 severity rating, the maximum classification on their scale, confirming that what people were seeing was not a new or different phenomenon but the existing, well-understood aurora mechanism being pushed to an intensity extreme enough to become visible in places. The underlying physics normally prevents it from reaching. The academic and scientific mainstream position on this is not in serious dispute. Aurora at extreme low latitudes during severe geomagnetic storms is documented, understood physics, not a new or unexplained category of event. The Carrington event of 1,859 produced aurora, reportedly visible as far south as the Caribbean, and multiple subsequent extreme storms throughout the instrumented historical record have produced similar, if less extensively documented and photographed, low-latitude displays. What made the May 2024 event distinct was not the underlying mechanism but the sheer volume and immediacy of documentation, occurring in an era of ubiquitous smartphone cameras and social media, meaning millions of ordinary people simultaneously became direct eyewitnesses to, and instant broadcasters of, an event that in 1859 would have been documented by a comparatively tiny number of scientific observers and newspaper reports. The event was not scientifically unprecedented. It was unprecedented in how immediately and universally visible it became to the general public. That distinction matters for how this seventh claim should be weighed, and it deserves the same restraint applied to the earlier sections of this video. Chapter 80's description of a visible celestial disorder, one that ordinary people looking up would notice without needing technical explanation, is not evidence that the text anticipated aurora specifically, geomagnetic storms specifically, or any of the underlying physics involved. What the parallel actually demonstrates, at most, is that the specific outcome the ancient text identifies as the final and most significant sign, disorder becoming visible to the ordinary observer rather than remaining a technical anomaly legible only to specialists, is precisely the category of event that occurred at record scale and record public visibility in the same year and connected to the same underlying solar activity already discussed as the modern parallel for the disordered chiefs. The seventh sign and the third sign, in the ancient text's own sequence, are not unrelated. They are presented as stages of the same underlying breakdown, gates and chiefs disordering first, at a level requiring specialized observation to notice, followed by a final stage in which the disorder becomes plainly visible to everyone. And in the specific modern case this video has been building toward, the same solar event, the same active region, the same week in May 2024, produced both the flare activity that made the third claim's parallel active and reported, and the extreme aurora visibility that makes the seventh claim's parallel active and reported within days of each other, from the same underlying physical cause. This is, to be direct about it, the closest this video comes to a genuinely striking convergence. Not because it proves anything about the ancient text's origin or authority, but because it means two of the seven claims examined here, presented in the ancient source as sequential stages of one connected breakdown process, have their most current and most widely reported modern parallels tracing back to literally the same calendar week, the same solar active region, and the same causal chain, a level of connectedness between the third and seventh claims that was not engineered or selected after the fact to create a tidy narrative. It is simply what happened when active region 3664 rotated into an Earth-facing position in early May 2024, and over the course of roughly a week, produced both the clustered, disproportionate flare activity that stood out against Solar Cycle 25's broader pattern, and the geomagnetic storm severe enough to push the auroral oval to the most extreme low-latitude visibility recorded in the current century. Taken together, the seven things covered across this video, the gate system and its structural echo in the heliospheric current sheet, the 364-day calendar, and its uncomfortable proximity to genuinely unprecedented modern length of day instability, the disordered chiefs of the stars, and their live parallel in solar cycle 25's active regions, the four winds and their functional echo in jet stream and polar vortex containment research, the storehouses and their conceptual mirror in atmospheric river science, the shortened years and their connection to climate-driven mass redistribution now measurably altering Earth's rotation, and finally the visible sky disorder of the seventh sign, manifesting in the same event window as the third, form a pattern that deserves to be stated with precision rather than either dismissed or oversold. None of these seven parallels, individually, constitutes proof that an ancient astronomical text encoded specific foreknowledge of 21st century geophysics, heliophysics, or atmospheric science. Every one of them has a well-evidenced, well-reasoned mainstream explanation rooted in ancient Near Eastern cosmological convention, Babylonian astronomical transmission, and the genre conventions of Second Temple apocalyptic literature, and those explanations have been stated here, in each section, as fully and fairly as their strongest academic proponents would state them. What is harder to dismiss is the aggregate pattern across all seven, the fact that a text assembled at minimum 22 centuries ago, organized around a technical vocabulary of gates, chambers, winds, and prescribed order, keeps producing structural echoes in exactly the categories of modern Earth and space science that did not exist as measurable disciplines until the final decades of the 20th century or later: heliophysics requiring space-based instrumentation, atmospheric river science requiring satellite-based water vapor tracking, polar vortex stratospheric research requiring high-altitude balloon and satellite reanalysis data, and length of day precision measurement requiring atomic clocks that were not invented until 1955. The mainstream reading treats this as coincidence, compounded across seven independent comparisons, each individually unremarkable, collectively noteworthy only because seven were selected and presented together. That is a fair methodological objection, and it deserves to be taken seriously by anyone weighing this material. The alternative reading, the one this video has laid out claim by claim without asserting as conclusion, is that the specific, mechanical, procedural, a load-bearing way this text insists the sky actually operates, an insistence dismissed for most of the last 2,000 years as ancient cosmological fantasy unworthy of serious technical comparison, keeps landing closer to how the sky actually physically behaves than the intuitive, pre-scientific folk cosmology that surrounded it in the same historical period ever did. It is worth going back, now that all seven claims and their modern parallels have been laid out, and actually walking through the specific numbers the gate system uses, because summarizing it as a 12-gate structure understates how granular the text actually gets, and that granularity is itself part of the evidence Neugebauer weighed when he concluded the material required genuine technical training to produce. Chapter 72 specifies the daylight and nighttime portions associated with each of the six operative gates, using a unit system based on dividing daylight into 18 parts. At the gate, the text identifies as governing the winter solstice period. The sun rises, granting a day of 12 parts of daylight against 18 parts. Expressed as a ratio, the text calls the shortest day, and correspondingly the longest night. As the sun moves to the second gate, the ratio shifts to 13 parts daylight, then 14 at the third gate, 15 at the fourth, continuing in a strict linear progression of 1 part per gate transition, until it reaches the gate the text identifies with the summer solstice, at which point daylight reaches its maximum proportion, and then the sequence reverses, gate by gate, back down to the winter minimum, completing a full cycle. This is the specific arithmetic scheme Neugebauer identified as matching the linear zigzag function method used in Babylonian System A astronomical texts, a documented mathematical technique in which a quantity that actually varies in a smooth, roughly sinusoidal curve across a year, the real physical relationship between solar declination and day length, is modeled instead as a simplified linear ramp, increasing by equal increments to a maximum and then decreasing by the same equal increments back to a minimum, an approximation method that sacrifices some precision in exchange for being calculable using only addition and subtraction, without requiring the kind of trigonometric function tables that would not be developed in any tradition, Babylonian, Greek, or otherwise, until centuries after the astronomical material in Enoch had already taken the form scholars now study. This detail matters because it means the specific choice to model the sun's changing gate position and daylight ratio as a linear stepped function. Rather than describing the phenomenon in purely qualitative terms, days get longer in summer and shorter in winter, which any culture with a memory longer than 1 year could state without any specialized astronomical training at all, reflects a specific, identifiable technical methodology borrowed from a documented external astronomical tradition. Francesca Rochberg's broader body of work on Babylonian celestial science describes this System A zigzag method in detail as one of the two primary mathematical schemes Babylonian scribes used across a wide range of astronomical precision. Prediction texts, tracking not just solar day length but lunar visibility periods, planetary phenomena, and other periodic celestial quantities, all using the same underlying linear approximation strategy. The presence of this exact strategy, applied to solar day length specifically, inside a Jewish text compiled centuries after the peak of Babylonian astronomical scholarship, but during a period, the Second Temple era, in which sustained cultural and intellectual contact between Jewish scribal communities and the broader Mesopotamian and Hellenistic intellectual world is independently well documented through numerous other channels, is precisely the kind of specific, technical, traceable borrowing that moves this material out of the category of vague ancient cosmological speculation and into the category of a genuine, if adapted, transmission of a real ancient mathematical astronomy tradition. The wind and storehouse material shows a related but distinct kind of technical structuring worth noting briefly here as well. Chapter 76's description of 12 gates in each of the 4 cardinal directions, 48 total wind gates, each associated with specific effects ranging from beneficial to destructive depending on which specific gate a given wind emerges from, mirrors the broader ancient Near Eastern tradition of omen literature, in which specific outcomes are correlated with specific observed conditions in a systematic, catalog-like fashion. This is the same basic organizational principle underlying the vast corpus of Mesopotamian omen texts, the tradition that produced compilations like the astrological omen series Enuma, Anu, and Lil, in which specific celestial or atmospheric conditions are cataloged exhaustively alongside their predicted consequences. The Enochic wind material is not identical to that tradition in content. It does not predict royal fortunes or military outcomes the way Enuma, Anu, Enlil does, but it borrows the same underlying structural logic, exhaustive, systematic cataloging of discrete positional variants, each carrying a specific assigned outcome, again suggesting the compilers of this material were working within and adapting a real and specific ancient technical genre rather than inventing an unstructured cosmological narrative from nothing. None of this technical borrowing is controversial among specialists. It is, in fact, the mainstream scholarly explanation for where this material's sophistication comes from, and it has been stated as such by every serious scholar cited throughout this video: Neugebauer, Rochberg, Millick, Black, Nib, and more recently Dronal, all of whom, despite differing in their specific areas of focus, and in some cases their overall assessment of how directly the Enochic material depends on Babylonian sources versus representing an independent but structurally similar Jewish development, agree on the basic point that this material reflects genuine engagement with sophisticated ancient astronomical methodology, not folk cosmology dressed up in impressive-sounding numbers. The question this video has been asking throughout is not whether the ancient authors were sophisticated. The scholarly consensus already establishes that they were. The question is, why a text built using genuinely sophisticated ancient mathematical astronomy, adapted from real, documented Babylonian technical methods, keeps producing structural and conceptual echoes in the specific modern scientific findings this video has walked through, findings that required instrumentation, satellite platforms, and measurement precision that did not exist in any form until extremely recently, long after the mathematical methodology the ancient text borrowed had already fallen out of active use for over 1,000 years. One more thread deserves inclusion before pulling all 7 claims together, because it connects the astronomical material to a different section of the wider Enochic corpus, in a way that strengthens the internal case that this text treats sky disorder as a coherent, cross-reference system rather than isolated, unconnected warnings scattered across different chapters written at different times by different hands. The Book of Parables, chapters 37 through 71, generally regarded by scholars as a later addition to the Enochic corpus than the astronomical book, likely composed sometime in the 1st century BCE or possibly even the 1st century CE, closer to the turn of the era, based on linguistic and thematic analysis, notably absent from the Qumran fragments in a way that has led most specialists, including Milik in his original 1976 edition, to treat it as chronologically distinct from and later than the core astronomical material. Despite this later composition, the parables section returns repeatedly to the same vocabulary of celestial order and disorder established in the astronomical book, most directly in chapter 60, which was already referenced earlier in this video, in connection with the storehouses of hail and rain, but which also contains an extended passage describing the specific angels responsible for administering different aspects of the natural world, the spirit of the sea, the spirit of the frost, the spirit of the hail, the spirit of the snow, the spirit of the lightning, and the spirit of the thunder, each individually named and each described as having a specific administrative function tied to a specific natural phenomenon, extending the storehouse concept from the earlier astronomical chapters into an even more granular system of assigned celestial administration. This later material is significant for the argument of this video, specifically because Chapter 60's angel-by-angel breakdown of natural phenomena administration was composed by someone working within the same broad textual tradition as the earlier astronomical book, but at a later date, likely after direct access to the specific technical Babylonian astronomical methodology reflected in the earlier gate calculations had become less immediate within the tradition, and the later material shows exactly this shift, becoming more narrative and less strictly numerical, more focused on naming individual administering spirits than on providing precise day count tables. This pattern, a gradual drift from tightly technical, numerically precise material in the earliest layer toward more narrative, less mathematically rigorous material in later layers, is exactly what a textual historian would expect to see if the earliest astronomical material genuinely derived from direct, close contact with a real technical astronomical tradition that was gradually, over successive generations of transmission and redaction, being absorbed into a broader, more purely religious and narrative framework less concerned with preserving the original mathematical precision. Matthew Black's analysis specifically traces this drift, describing the relationship between the astronomical book and the later parables material as one in which what he called the astronomical schema of the earlier work becomes, in his words, theologized in the later material, retaining the same basic vocabulary of gates, storehouses, and administering spirits, but shifting the emphasis from precise operational description toward moral and eschatological meaning. This is directly relevant to how Chapter 80's warning material, which sits at the boundary between the purely technical astronomical chapters and the more narrative material surrounding them, should be read. It occupies a transitional position in the text's own internal history, technical enough to specify gates, chiefs, and prescribed paths using the same vocabulary as the numerically precise material earlier in the astronomical book, but oriented, like the later parables material, toward moral and eschatological consequence rather than pure operational description. This transitional character is likely part of why Chapter 80 has drawn more attention from scholars focused on Enoch's apocalyptic and eschatological themes than from scholars focused on its technical astronomical content, sitting, as it does, at exactly the seam between those two different modes the wider text employs. Understanding this internal textual history adds a layer of nuance to everything covered in this video. The 7 claims examined here are not drawn from a single, uniform, internally undifferentiated document. They are drawn from a composite text, with its own internal chronology, its own drift from precise technical material toward narrative theological material, and its own layered history of transmission, redaction, and eventual translation choices that shaped which parts of it received scholarly and popular attention over the following 2,000 years. Taking that internal complexity seriously, rather than treating the entire Book of Enoch as a single, undifferentiated block of ancient prophecy, is part of what separates a genuinely careful examination of this material from the kind of flattened, decontextualized treatment that tends to dominate popular discussion of ancient prophetic texts generally. Treatment this video has tried, throughout, not to fall into. This same principle, that a composite ancient text needs to be read with attention to its own internal layers, rather than treated as a single voice speaking with uniform authority across every chapter, applies with equal force to how the 7 modern scientific parallels covered in this video should themselves be weighed against one another. Some of them, the heliospheric current sheet structure and the polar vortex containment mechanism, rest on decades of accumulated satellite and reanalysis data and represent genuinely settled findings within their respective fields, however novel the specific comparison to Enoch might be. Others, Solar Cycle 25 still unfolding over performance and the precise near-term trajectory of Earth's rotational speedup, remain live, actively contested, and not yet fully resolved, even among the specialists studying them directly, meaning any comparison drawn to those specific findings carries an additional layer of provisional uncertainty beyond the provisional uncertainty already inherent in comparing ancient texts to modern science at all. A careful viewer should hold the 7 claims at different levels of confidence accordingly, treating the more settled scientific parallels as offering firmer ground for comparison than the still developing ones. Exactly the same discipline this video has tried to apply throughout in distinguishing between well-established modern findings and genuinely open, currently unresolved scientific questions. There is a broader ancient context worth placing this material inside before moving to synthesis, because the astronomical Book of Enoch did not develop in isolation, and understanding what surrounded it, in Babylon, and in Egypt specifically, clarifies both how unusual its specific technical claims are, and how firmly it sits within a genuine, well-documented ancient tradition of taking sky mechanics as seriously as any modern science does its own foundational questions. The Babylonian side of this comparison has already been touched on throughout this video through Neugebauer and Rochberg's work, but it is worth being specific about the actual source material scholars compare Enoch against. The Mull, APIN series, a 2-tablet Babylonian astronomical compendium whose oldest confidently dated copies go back to around 1000 BCE, though the astronomical content it preserves likely reflects observational traditions considerably older than that, catalogs the risings and settings of stars and constellations correlated with a structured calendar, provides methods for determining the length of daylight across the year using the same kind of linear zigzag arithmetic later reflected in Enoch's gate system, and includes intercalation rules for keeping a lunar calendar aligned with the solar year. The same basic problem Chapter 74 of Enoch addresses directly when it acknowledges the 10-day gap between its lunar and solar schemes. The specific numerical technique, dividing daylight into discrete unit ratios and stepping through them in equal linear increments across the year, is not something 2 independent cultures would be expected to invent identically by coincidence. It reflects direct or closely mediated technical transmission, and the historical window for that transmission, Jewish scribal contact with Babylonian intellectual culture during and after the Babylonian exile beginning in 597 BCE and continuing through the Persian period, is well documented through numerous other channels entirely independent of Enoch, including the administrative and commercial cuneiform tablets from the Murashu archive in Nippur that record Jewish names and business dealings within Babylonian institutional life during exactly this period. Direct, physical, non-Enochic evidence that Jewish communities were operating within, and presumably absorbing knowledge from, Babylonian intellectual and administrative culture during the centuries most scholars place the composition of Enoch's earliest astronomical layer. The Egyptian side of the comparison is less direct but still relevant, particularly regarding the storehouse and wind material rather than the gate calendar itself. Egyptian cosmology, reflected across a wide range of religious and funerary texts, spanning the pyramid texts of the Old Kingdom through the later Book of the Dead traditions, consistently describes the sky as a physical structure requiring active, ongoing maintenance and support, most famously personified as the sky goddess Nut, arched over the earth and held in position by the air god Shu, a structural cosmology conceptually parallel, though mythologically quite different in its specific characters and narrative, to the pillar and wind support system Enoch describes in chapters 34 through 36. Egyptian temple astronomical ceilings, including the well-documented example at the Temple of Hathor at Dendera, which preserves an extensive decan-based star chart system tracking the risings of 36 specific star groups across the year for calendrical and ritual timing purposes, demonstrate the same underlying impulse found in Enoch's gate system, organizing the sky's apparent motion into a fixed, countable, catalogable system of discrete markers rather than treating celestial motion as an unstructured continuous flow. The Dendera zodiac and decan system, though architecturally and artistically Ptolemaic period in its surviving physical form, is understood by Egyptologists to preserve a decan tradition with roots extending back into the Middle Kingdom, centuries before Enoch's composition, representing an independent ancient tradition of exactly the kind of structured, gate-like celestial organization Enoch's astronomical book employs, developed within a different civilization using different specific mechanics but converging on the same basic organizational principle. None of this Egyptian material is being presented as a direct source for Enoch's specific gate numbers or calendar structure, and no serious scholar argues for direct Egyptian textual dependence on the level Babylonian influence is documented. What it demonstrates instead is that the underlying impulse driving Enoch's astronomical book, insisting that the sky's apparent motion must be organized into a discrete, countable, structurally maintained system rather than treated as continuous and unstructured, was not an isolated or unusual ancient idea confined to one obscure Jewish text. It was a widely shared ancient Near Eastern and Mediterranean intellectual commitment, expressed independently across Babylonian mathematical astronomy, Egyptian temple cosmology and decan tracking, and, later, the Enochic tradition, each civilization developing its own specific technical vocabulary and mechanics, but converging repeatedly on the same underlying conviction that the sky's true nature, beneath its smooth, naked-eye appearance, was discrete, structured, and countable. That convergence across independent ancient traditions is itself worth weighing against the modern findings covered throughout this video, because it changes the shape of the argument slightly. This is not a case of one isolated ancient text making an unusual claim that happens to match modern science by chance. It is a case of multiple independent ancient civilizations, working with entirely separate religious and mythological frameworks, arriving repeatedly at the same underlying structural intuition about the sky, an intuition that modern instrumented science, entirely independently and for entirely separate empirical reasons, arrived at again, discovering that the sun's magnetic environment, the atmosphere's major circulation systems, and the planet's own rotational behavior are genuinely organized into discrete, structured, countable systems rather than the smooth, continuous phenomena they appear to be from an unaided, ground-level vantage point. One further Egyptian detail strengthens this comparative point specifically in relation to the storehouse and wind material covered earlier in this video. The pyramid texts, inscribed inside the Pyramid of Unas at Saqqara around 2350 BCE, making them among the oldest religious texts to survive from anywhere in the ancient world, predating Enoch's composition by close to 2,000 years, already contain spell sequences describing specific, named regions of the sky through which the deceased pharaoh's spirit is described as passing on its journey among the stars, organized around specific celestial gates and thresholds guarded by specific named entities who must be addressed correctly for passage to be granted, an organizational structure conceptually parallel to Enoch's gate system, despite being separated from it by roughly 2 millennia and by 2 entirely distinct religious and cultural traditions, with no plausible direct line of textual transmission between them. Egyptologist James Allen, whose translation and analysis of the pyramid texts remains a standard scholarly reference, has described this gated cosmological structure as one of the most persistent organizing principles across the full 3,000-year span of ancient Egyptian religious literature, appearing in modified form from the Old Kingdom pyramid texts, through the Middle Kingdom coffin texts, and into the New Kingdom Book of the Dead tradition, evidence of a genuinely long-lived, independently sustained Egyptian cosmological tradition organizing the sky into discrete, gated, countable regions entirely separate from the Babylonian mathematical tradition this video has argued most directly influenced Enoch's specific numerical gate scheme. Whether that repeated ancient convergence reflects something real, those civilizations were picking up on through careful long-term naked-eye observation across many generations, a genuinely underappreciated ancient observational tradition, or simply reflects a natural human cognitive tendency to impose discrete, countable structure onto continuous phenomena, regardless of whether that structure is empirically accurate, which happened, in this specific case, to turn out to be closer to physically true than anyone at the time could have known, is, again, a question this video is laying out rather than resolving. One passage that connects the sky disorder material to the wider Enochic narrative more directly than anything covered so far sits outside the astronomical book proper, in chapter 106, part of a later section sometimes called the Birth of Noah narrative, and it is worth including here because it is the passage that most explicitly ties celestial disorder to a specific, dated, catastrophic outcome within the text's own internal chronology, functioning as a kind of narrative payoff for the warning material in chapter 80 that has anchored so much of this video. Chapter 106 describes the birth of Noah in unusual, almost alarming physical terms. An infant whose body is described as white as snow and red as a blooming rose, with eyes that light up the house like the sun, prompting his father Lamech to fear the child was not fully human and to seek out Enoch himself for an explanation. Enoch's response, delivered across the following chapter, connects Noah's birth directly to an approaching judgment on the earth, describing a coming flood specifically as consequence and cleansing, tied to the corruption the Watchers introduced, the same fallen angels material that dominates the earlier chapters of the book. What is relevant for this video's purposes is the specific language Enoch uses to describe how that coming judgment will be recognized before it arrives, language that echoes, almost verbatim in the surviving Ethiopic text, the celestial disorder vocabulary established in chapter 80, describing a shaking that will affect the Earth's foundations and disturbances in the natural order that will precede the floodwaters themselves, tying the sky and calendar disorder material examined throughout this video not to an abstract, disconnected future warning, but to the text's own account of what actually preceded its central catastrophic event, the flood, positioning the astronomical breakdown material as, in the text's own internal logic, a documented historical precedent rather than a purely speculative future prophecy. This detail is significant because it changes how Chapter 80's warning should be read within the full architecture of the book. It is not simply predicting a future event using generic apocalyptic imagery borrowed from a stock genre convention. It is drawing on the same descriptive vocabulary the text itself uses to describe an event it presents as having already happened once, within its own narrative chronology, the flood, meaning the ancient compilers of this material appear to have understood celestial and calendrical disorder as a recurring category of event with historical precedent, within their own tradition, not a one-time or purely hypothetical future occurrence, a framing that adds weight to why the astronomical book invests so much careful, procedural detail in documenting exactly what the properly functioning system looks like so that any future departure from it could be recognized and understood against a known, documented baseline, the same basic logic underlying why modern space weather agencies maintain decades of baseline solar cycle data, specifically so that departures like Solar Cycle 25's overperformance can be identified and measured against an established norm rather than simply asserted anecdotally. Returning to the patristic reception history covered earlier in this video, it is worth adding one further specific detail about Augustine's engagement with Enoch that clarifies his actual position more precisely than a general summary allows. Augustine's discussion in City of God, Book 15, Chapter 23, does not reject the entire Book of Enoch as fraudulent or valueless. His argument is more specific and, in its own way, more interesting. He acknowledges that Enoch is mentioned favorably in the canonical Epistle of Jude, which directly quotes a line from Enoch chapter 1, creating a genuine theological problem for anyone wanting to dismiss the broader Enochic tradition entirely, since a canonical New Testament text treats Enoch's prophetic authority as real. Augustine's resolution is to argue that the specific book circulating under Enoch's name in his own era had been corrupted through unreliable transmission, containing material that could not be trusted, even if some authentic core of genuine Enochic material might once have existed and might even be the specific material, Jude quotes, a position that is considerably more nuanced than a blanket rejection, and one that leaves open, within Augustine's own stated reasoning, the possibility that specific sections of the text in circulation could represent more reliable transmission than others, without Augustine ever specifying which sections he considered more or less reliable. Jerome's position, referenced earlier in this video, is documented primarily through a brief but pointed comment in his preface to his commentary on the Epistle of Titus, where he references Enoch dismissively in the context of discussing apocryphal literature more broadly, though Jerome's own relationship with Enoch was more complicated across his career than this single dismissive reference suggests, since earlier in his career, before his mature position hardened, Jerome's own writing shows familiarity with, and even occasional positive citation of Enochic material, a shift scholars including the patristic specialist James Vanderkam, whose work spans both the Qumran material and the patristic reception history, have noted as part of a broader trend across the 4th century in which the Western Latin Church's relationship with the wider body of Second Temple Jewish literature hardened considerably compared to the more permissive attitudes of earlier generations of Christian writers, a hardening that reflects the specific theological and canonical anxieties of the 4th century Church more than it reflects any specific, documented objection to the astronomical book's technical content in particular. Whatever combination of these theological, calendrical, and institutional pressures actually drove the decision at Laodicea, the practical outcome was the same: a text containing some of the most technically sophisticated ancient astronomical material ever compiled by a Jewish scribal tradition, was set aside, left to survive only at the margins of the Christian world, in Ethiopia and in the sealed caves above the Dead Sea, for the better part of 2,000 years. That survival, against council decree, against translation neglect, against 17 centuries of general indifference, is itself the reason any of the 7 comparisons in this video are possible to make at all today. Having gone through all 7 things the text claims, it is worth spending real time on why this specific section of Enoch, out of the entire document, ended up as obscure as it is, even among people who have some general familiarity with the Book of Enoch as a whole. The fallen angels material gets documentaries, gets referenced in popular culture, gets discussed on podcasts, and in comment sections. The astronomical book, despite making up roughly a quarter of the total text and despite being, by the assessment of serious historians of ancient astronomy like Neugebauer, the most technically sophisticated material in the entire document, gets almost none of that attention. That imbalance has a documented history behind it, one that involves specific decisions made by specific people at specific points across 2,000 years of transmission, and it deserves to be laid out plainly. The Council of Laodicea in 364 CE, the event every treatment of Enoch's exclusion from the biblical canon eventually cites, produced a set of canons, numbered church regulations, and Canon 60 of that council is the one most directly relevant to Enoch's removal, listing the books considered acceptable for reading in church and, by omission, excluding a substantial body of literature that had circulated among various Christian and Jewish communities up to that point, Enoch included. What the surviving conciliar record does not do, and this is a genuinely important distinction from how this exclusion sometimes gets characterized, is provide detailed theological reasoning specific to Enoch's content. Canon 60 is a list. It does not include commentary explaining why each excluded text was excluded, which means later scholars, including the scholars whose work this video has drawn on throughout, have had to reconstruct the reasoning from surrounding patristic writing, meaning the letters, commentaries, and treatises of church fathers writing in the same general period, rather than from a single authoritative source explaining the council's specific objections to specific content. That reconstructed reasoning, drawn from writers like Jerome and Augustine in the following decades, focuses overwhelmingly, as covered in earlier treatments of this material, on the fallen angels' narrative, the Watchers, their forbidden teachings, their imprisonment, material that raised direct theological problems around the nature of angelic beings, sin, and the origin of evil that were live doctrinal controversies in the 4th and 5th century church. Augustine's discussion of Enoch in the City of God addresses the Watcher's narrative specifically and at length. What neither Augustine nor Jerome's surviving writing spends comparable attention on is the astronomical book, specifically the calendar material, the gate system, the wind and storehouse chapters. This is worth noting plainly, rather than reading too much into. The absence of direct patristic commentary on the astronomical chapters could simply reflect that this material was, to 4th and 5th century theologians, steeped in a very different set of doctrinal concerns, genuinely less theologically interesting than the angels and giants material, a mundane technical appendix compared to the parts of the book that spoke directly to live controversies about the nature of sin and evil. But there is a separate, more specific thread of evidence worth including, because it comes from a different angle entirely: the history of the 364-day calendar dispute itself, which did not end when the Qumran community's manuscripts were sealed in caves, sometime before 70 CE. The broader question of solar versus lunar calendar reckoning remained a live and genuinely contentious issue within both Judaism and early Christianity for centuries afterward, most visibly in the recurring, sometimes bitter disputes over the correct date for calculating Easter, a controversy significant enough that it was one of the primary items of business at the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, less than 40 years before the Council of Laodicea addressed Enoch's canonical status. The Nicaea dispute concerned the relationship between the lunar cycle, used to fix Passover and by extension Easter, and the solar year, and different regional Christian communities, most notably the churches of Alexandria and Rome versus certain churches in Britain and Ireland, continued calculating the date differently for centuries after Nicaea supposedly settled the question, a disagreement significant enough that it required renewed negotiation at the Synod of Whitby in 664 CE, 3 centuries after Nicaea, and exactly 3 centuries after Laodicea. Given that backdrop, a document containing a fully worked out, alternative 364-day solar calendar scheme, one that Qumran evidence shows had genuinely been used by at least one real historical community in direct tension with mainstream Jewish practice, and one that, unlike the standard lunar-solar hybrid calendars in wider use, required no periodic manual correction to keep festival dates aligned with the same day of the week year after year. Sitting inside a text under consideration for canonical status at the exact historical moment the wider church was actively fighting over calendar calculation methodology is at minimum an interesting coincidence of timing. Whether it rose to the level of a specific, articulated objection to Enoch's astronomical chapters in the actual deliberations at Laodicea is not something the surviving historical record allows anyone to state with certainty, because, as already noted, the conciliar record itself does not preserve detailed reasoning. This is a place where honest treatment of the material requires acknowledging the limit of what can actually be documented versus what can only be inferred from surrounding context and coincidental timing. What is documented, rather than inferred, is the subsequent translation history, and this is where a clearer pattern of specific choices becomes visible. When Richard Lawrence produced the first modern English translation of the complete Ethiopic text in 1821, working from a single manuscript he had acquired, his edition of the astronomical chapters was, by the assessment of later scholars, including Charles and Knibb, considerably less careful and less complete than his treatment of the Watcher's narrative, containing numerous transcription and translation errors specifically concentrated in the technical, numerically dense gate and calendar material, errors that persisted in general circulation for decades before more careful critical editions. Drawing on additional manuscripts unavailable to Lawrence, corrected them. R. H. Charles, producing his own influential translation in 1906 and revised edition in 1912, which became the standard English reference for most of the 20th century, and the version through which the vast majority of general readers, students, and popular writers actually encountered Enoch, was notably more thorough on the astronomical material than Lawrence had been, but Charles's own introduction to his translation explicitly characterizes the astronomical chapters as, in his words, of comparatively minor interest to the general reader, and structures his introduction and commentary accordingly, devoting the overwhelming majority of his analytical attention to the Watcher's narrative and later apocalyptic sections, while treating the astronomical material largely as a technical appendix, requiring less interpretive engagement. This editorial framing, present in the single most influential English translation of Enoch for most of the 20th century, the edition through which generations of scholars, students, and general readers first encountered the text, had a real and traceable downstream effect. It is not suppression in the sense of active concealment. Charles did translate and publish the full astronomical material. It was available to anyone who read his edition cover to cover, but by explicitly framing it, in his own authorial voice, as of comparatively minor interest, he shaped how generations of readers approached the material before they ever engaged with it directly, priming an entire tradition of popular and even much scholarly engagement with Enoch to treat the astronomical book as skippable filler between the more dramatic Watcher's narrative and the later parable and epistle sections, rather than as the technically sophisticated, internally consistent cosmological system that specialists like Neugebauer, working independently and decades later with a background in the history of mathematical astronomy rather than biblical studies, would eventually recognize it as. Otto Neugebauer's 1981 monograph, published through the Royal Danish Academy of Sciences and Letters, specifically because it was a work of technical astronomical history rather than biblical scholarship, exists somewhat outside the citation network of mainstream Enoch studies for exactly this reason. It was written by, and largely read by, historians of ancient science rather than biblical scholars, meaning its specific finding that the astronomical material shows a level of internal mathematical consistency requiring genuine technical training to produce, has had limited crossover into the broader scholarly and popular conversation about Enoch, which remains, to this day, dominated by discussion of the Watchers, the Giants, and the imprisoned angels, following the same emphasis, R. H. Charles established more than a century ago, and that later, more historically informed editors, including Knibb and Black, despite giving the astronomical material considerably more careful and rigorous treatment in their own critical editions, have not managed to fully dislodge from general awareness. The practical result of this century-long editorial and disciplinary drift is what opened this video. A document sitting in the British Library under catalogue number OR 485, and its companion manuscripts held at the Vatican and, in fragmentary but critically important form, in Jerusalem's Israel Museum, where the Qumran fragments are housed, containing roughly a quarter of the entire Book of Enoch, technically sophisticated enough to draw serious analysis from the 20th century's foremost historian of ancient astronomy, and functionally invisible to the general public, not because any single body deliberately suppressed it in the way the term suppression usually implies, but because a chain of individual editorial choices, starting with a 4th century council that left no detailed record of its specific reasoning, continuing through a 19th century translator working from incomplete source material, and cementing through a 20th century standard edition whose introduction explicitly characterized the material as secondary in interest, produced the same practical outcome active suppression would have. A significant, technically remarkable portion of an ancient text describing the operation of the sky in terms that keep intersecting with modern Earth and space science in ways this video has tried to document honestly and proportionately remains, for almost everyone who has ever heard of the Book of Enoch, something they have never actually read. The present-day status of the primary manuscripts is worth covering in its own right, because it clarifies what is and is not actually accessible to an independent researcher today, as opposed to what is accessible only in summary or through secondary scholarly description, a distinction that matters for anyone who wants to verify any of the claims made across this video, rather than simply accepting them. The Dead Sea Scroll fragments 4Q 208 through 4Q 211 are the most accessible primary source discussed in this video. In the specific sense that high-resolution digital images of the Qumran fragments, including the astronomical material, have been made publicly available through the Leon Levy Dead Sea Scrolls Digital Library, a project developed by the Israel Antiquities Authority in partnership with Google, launched in 2011 and expanded significantly in subsequent years, allowing anyone with an internet connection to view the actual Aramaic fragments at a resolution far exceeding what earlier generations of scholars working from physical access or lower quality photographs had available. This represents a genuine and significant shift in accessibility compared to the situation as recently as the 1990s, when access to unpublished Qumran material was, famously and controversially, restricted to a small circle of scholars for decades after the scroll's initial 1947 discovery, a restriction that became a significant scholarly controversy in its own right through the 1980s and early 1990s before mounting academic pressure and, eventually, the unauthorized circulation of a reconstructed concordance in 1991 led to the broader opening of access that eventually produced projects like the Leon Levy Digital Library 2 decades later. The complete Ethiopic manuscripts present a more complicated picture. The British Library's 485 and comparable manuscripts held by other Western institutions, including the Bodleian Library at Oxford and several German collections, are technically accessible to researchers through standard institutional request processes, the same process that would apply to requesting access to any historical manuscript in these collections, not a special or heightened restriction specific to Enoch. However, the manuscripts held within Ethiopia itself, particularly those associated with the churches at Axum, including material connected to the broader Ge'ez manuscript tradition this text descends from, exist under a genuinely different access framework, one governed by Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church Authority over its own liturgical and historical materials, combined with Ethiopian national cultural property law that was significantly tightened following the 1974 revolution that overthrew the imperial government, a legal and institutional framework under which international scholarly access to certain manuscript holdings has, at various points over the subsequent decades, been formally restricted, delayed, or denied, as documented in published accounts by researchers including Dr. James Vanderkam, whose decades of work on Enoch and the Qumran material has included direct engagement with the practical difficulties of manuscript access across these different institutional frameworks. Vanderkam has written and spoken publicly about the layered, sometimes years-long process required to secure access to specific comparative manuscript material for critical edition work, a process rooted in entirely legitimate and understandable concerns about cultural patrimony, manuscript preservation, and an Ethiopian church and state's authority over materials central to their own religious and national heritage, not in any conspiracy to suppress the content itself, but with the practical effect that a genuinely comprehensive critical comparison across every surviving manuscript witness to the astronomical book remains, even now, an unfinished scholarly project rather than a completed one. This matters directly for the claims in this video, because it means the specific textual questions this material raises, precisely how consistent the numerical gate and calendar data is across every surviving manuscript witness, whether there are meaningful variants in the technical astronomical figures between the Ethiopic tradition and the earlier Aramaic Qumran fragments beyond what has already been identified and published, and what the full extent of J.T. Millick's observation about the astronomical material representing a potentially earlier, more purely technical textual layer actually implies, once compared against every available witness rather than the subset that has been fully collated and published, remain genuinely open areas of ongoing textual scholarship, not settled questions with a single definitive answer already established and simply awaiting popular discovery. The current state of academic engagement with this material, as of the research underlying this video, shows renewed rather than diminished interest. Worth noting because it complicates any simple narrative of the astronomical chapters being permanently sidelined. The Enoch Seminar, an international, ongoing series of scholarly conferences dedicated specifically to Enochic literature and Second Temple Judaism, founded by Gabriele Boccaccini and running continuously since 2001 with meetings held across multiple countries, has included dedicated sessions on the astronomical book across several of its meetings, and more recent scholarly work, including a full critical commentary volume on the astronomical Book of Enoch published by Fortress Press as part of the Hermeneia commentary series, authored by Henrik Dronell and drawing extensively on renewed analysis of the Aramaic fragments, has continued refining the technical understanding of exactly how the gate system, the calendar mathematics, and the wind and storehouse material relate to broader ancient Near Eastern astronomical and cosmological traditions. Dronell's specific contribution has been to trace detailed technical connections between the Enochic astronomical scheme and cuneiform astronomical and mathematical traditions, with a level of comparative philological rigor that extends and refines, rather than contradicts, the foundational technical assessment Neugebauer offered decades earlier. None of this ongoing academic work is secret, restricted, or suppressed in any meaningful sense. It is published, peer-reviewed, presented at open academic conferences, and available through standard university library and academic database access. The same as scholarship on any other ancient text. What it is not, and this returns to the point made earlier about the century-long editorial drift established by Charles's influential early translation, is widely known outside the specific circle of scholars who work on Second Temple Jewish literature, ancient astronomy, and Dead Sea Scrolls research. A genuinely rigorous, technically sophisticated, and actively continuing body of scholarship exists on exactly the material this video has spent its runtime walking through, and almost none of it has meaningfully crossed over into general public awareness of what the Book of Enoch actually contains. An awareness that remains, for most people who have heard the name at all, limited to a vague sense that it involves fallen angels and giants, with the astronomical material that makes up roughly a quarter of the actual text remaining, for practical purposes, unknown territory. It is worth walking back through all 7 claims together now, not to repeat what has already been covered in detail, but to hold them up against each other and ask a question that only becomes visible once they are viewed as a set rather than as 7 isolated comparisons scattered across a long video. The first claim, the gate system governing the sun and moon's daily motion, produced a structural echo in the heliospheric current sheet, the sun's actual magnetic field organized into discrete rotating sectors that Earth passes through in a fixed, trackable, recurring order. A phenomenon requiring space-based magnetometry and decades of solar mission data to establish, unavailable to any observer before the mid-20th century at the very earliest. The second claim, the fixed 364-day year the text insists is the sky's true operating parameter, produced a genuinely uncomfortable proximity to length of day instability that has only become measurable and scientifically significant within the last several years, forcing international timekeeping bodies to consider, for the first time in the atomic clock era, a correction that has never before been implemented. The third claim, the disordered chiefs of the stars, produced the most currently live and actively developing parallel in this entire video, tracing directly to solar cycle 25's still ongoing overperformance relative to official prediction and the specific, individually anomalous behavior of active region 3,664 inches, May 2024. A situation space weather agencies are continuing to monitor, model, and publish on, as this video is being produced, with no final resolution yet available because the underlying solar cycle has not yet concluded. The fourth claim, the four winds holding up the structure of the sky, produced a functional parallel in polar jet stream and polar vortex containment research, an area of atmospheric science that has documented, within the last 2 decades specifically, a measurable weakening of exactly the containment mechanism the ancient text describes as structurally essential, tied to Arctic amplification warming at nearly 4 times the global average rate and already directly implicated in specific, federally investigated infrastructure disasters. The fifth claim, the storehouses of hail, snow, dew, and rain, released in variable quantities from bounded reservoirs, produced a conceptual parallel in atmospheric river science, a field that did not have a standardized public vocabulary or severity ranking system until February 2019, despite the phenomenon it describes being responsible for the majority of water resources across an entire region of North America and for some of the most destructive individual flood events in recent American history. The sixth claim, years and days becoming shorter as part of the described breakdown, connected to newly published, peer-reviewed geophysical research, documenting Earth's rotational speed being actively altered by 2 separate, currently operating mechanisms, one originating in the planet's molten core, and one originating in climate-driven glacial mass redistribution, a mechanism with no meaningful precedent before the industrial era, and only recently large enough to be measured with confidence. And the seventh claim, the luminaries visibly changing their order in a way ordinary people would notice without technical instruction, connected directly back to the same May 2024 event window as the third claim, the same active region, the same week, producing the most widely witnessed and photographed extreme latitude aurora event of the current century, an event that transformed an obscure space weather phenomenon into something millions of ordinary people experience directly and simultaneously, looking up from their own backyards. Here is the honest accounting this video owes you before it closes. 7 comparisons is a small sample. Any researcher trained in statistical reasoning would immediately and correctly note that selecting 7 claims from a longer document and finding modern parallels for each of them says relatively little on its own, because the selection process itself, choosing which claims to highlight and which modern phenomena to compare them against, is not a blind or pre-registered process. It was performed by someone, in this case by the researchers and writers who compiled this video, with full knowledge of what modern Earth and space science has documented, which creates an obvious opportunity, whether deliberate or not, for the comparisons to be chosen specifically because they seem to fit, while other claims in the same text that fit less well, or comparisons that would have produced no interesting modern parallel at all, went unexamined or unmentioned. This is not a small methodological concern. It is, honestly stated, the single strongest objection to everything this video has presented, and it deserves to be named plainly rather than left as an unstated gap for a skeptical viewer to notice on their own. Anyone approaching this material rigorously should also weigh the base rate problem directly. Ancient cosmological and calendrical texts, across essentially every literate civilization that produced them, made a very large number of claims about the sky, the seasons, the weather, and celestial order, and modern Earth and space science has, over the past several decades, documented an equally large and rapidly expanding number of real, measurable phenomena across those same broad categories. Given a sufficiently large ancient text making a sufficiently large number of loosely defined claims about celestial and atmospheric behavior, and a sufficiently large and still growing body of modern scientific findings across the same general subject areas, finding some number of comparisons that can be framed as parallels, with enough interpretive latitude in how tightly or loosely parallel needs to be defined, becomes close to inevitable, a version of the same statistical phenomenon that produces apparent Bible codes, apparent Nostradamus predictions, and apparent numerological coincidences across a wide range of source material when a large enough text is compared against a large enough body of subsequent events with sufficient interpretive flexibility in how the match is drawn. That is the strongest form of the skeptical case, and it deserves to sit here, stated plainly, without being immediately undercut or walked back. This video has tried, in each individual section, to state clearly and fully what each parallel is not, and to present the genuine mainstream academic explanation for the ancient material on its own terms before introducing any modern comparison. That practice was not incidental. It was the specific discipline this video attempted to hold itself to throughout, precisely because the alternative, presenting only the parallels while omitting the well-evidenced conventional explanations, would produce exactly the kind of overstated, cherry-picked pattern the base rate objection above correctly warns against. That is the strongest form of the skeptical case, and it deserves to sit here, stated plainly, without being immediately undercut or walked back. This video has tried, in each individual section, to state clearly and fully what each parallel is not, and to present the genuine mainstream academic explanation for the ancient material on its own terms, before introducing any modern comparison. That practice was not incidental. It was the specific discipline this video attempted to hold itself to throughout, precisely because the alternative, presenting only the parallels, while omitting the well-evidenced conventional explanations, would produce exactly the kind of overstated, cherry-picked pattern the base rate objection above correctly warns against. What remains, after that full and honest accounting, is not proof of anything. It is a documented convergence. 7 specific technical claims drawn from a genre of ancient text with no obvious mechanism for accessing modern Earth and space science, landing with enough structural and conceptual precision against 7 specific, independently verifiable, currently active or recently established bodies of scientific research that the convergence is worth presenting, worth sitting with, and worth letting each individual viewer weigh for themselves against the genuine methodological limitations this video has tried not to hide. The 7 things the sky-focused chapters of Enoch describe are, each of them, real claims made by a real, physically surviving ancient document. The 7 modern parallels are, each of them, drawn from real, citable, publicly available scientific sources, not invented or exaggerated for the purposes of this video. What connects them? Whether genuine convergence, ancient observational insight later validated by unrelated modern instrumentation, cultural transmission of astronomical knowledge more sophisticated than commonly credited, or simply the predictable statistical result of comparing a large ancient text against a large modern scientific record with enough interpretive flexibility to find matches, is a question this video has laid out the evidence for on both sides of, and is not going to resolve for you in the final minutes of a documentary, because it is not, honestly, a question that has been resolved. Return, for a moment, to where this video began. The manuscript in the British Library, or 485, sitting in its climate-controlled case, available to any researcher who submits the appropriate request through the standard institutional process, but read, in practice, by almost no one outside the small circle of scholars who specialize in Second Temple Jewish literature and the history of ancient astronomy. Its companion witnesses, the Vatican's Cod, Vat. et. 71. The Qumran fragments now digitized and publicly viewable through the Leon Levy Library, and the broader Ethiopic manuscript tradition held within Ethiopia itself under a separate and, at points over the last 5 decades, more restricted access framework governed by the church and state that have preserved this material continuously since before Western scholarship ever encountered it. None of these manuscripts are hidden in the sense of being deliberately concealed from the world. They are simply unread by almost everyone, relative to how thoroughly the far more famous sections of the same document, the fallen angels, the giants, the flood, have been picked apart, dramatized, and discussed. The specific technical questions this video has raised along the way remain, as of this recording, genuinely open. Solar Cycle 25 has not concluded. NOAA's Space Weather Prediction Center continues to update its monthly observed sunspot figures, and researchers continue to publish new analysis trying to explain why the cycle overperformed its official prediction as thoroughly and as persistently as it has, a question that does not yet have a settled answer even within the mainstream heliophysics community that studies it professionally and without any reference to ancient texts at all. The negative leap second question remains formally unresolved, with international timekeeping bodies continuing to monitor whether and when Earth's currently accelerating rotation will require an adjustment that has never once been implemented in the history of atomic timekeeping, a genuinely unprecedented decision point that current projections suggest could arrive by the end of this decade if present trends continue, though Agnew's own 2022 research specifically noted that the timeline had already been pushed later than earlier projections once the masking effect of glacial mass redistribution was properly accounted for, meaning even the experts studying this most directly do not currently agree on precisely when or under exactly what conditions that unprecedented correction might actually become necessary. The full critical comparison of every surviving manuscript witness to the astronomical book, incorporating material held within Ethiopia under its own separate access framework, remains, by the account of scholars actively working on it, an unfinished project rather than a completed one. None of this is being presented as a cliffhanger for its own sake. It is simply the honest state of things. A 2,200-year-old document describes, in careful, repetitive, procedural detail, a version of the sky organized around gates, chambers, winds, and a specific fixed number of chief stars capable of breaking from their assigned order, and warns that when that order breaks, first in ways only a trained observer would notice, and finally in ways any person looking up would see for themselves, the consequences extend beyond the sky itself into the food supply and the basic rhythm of life for whoever is standing under it. Modern Earth and space science, working with instruments and observational reach that would have been unimaginable to whoever compiled this text, has spent the last several decades independently documenting real, measurable versions of nearly every category of disruption this ancient warning describes: magnetic sector structures in the sun's own field, rotational speed instability serious enough to threaten global timekeeping standards, an active solar cycle producing individually disordered regions that outpaced official prediction, a weakening polar containment system already tied to real infrastructure disasters, a newly named and ranked category of concentrated water delivery responsible for both sustaining and periodically devastating an entire region, and a night sky that, for 1 week in May of 2024, put on a display over the backyards of people who had never had any reason to expect it and will likely never see anything like it again for years. None of this is being presented as a cliffhanger for its own sake. It is simply the honest state of things. A 2,200-year-old document describes, in careful, repetitive, procedural detail, a version of the sky organized around gates, chambers, winds, and a specific fixed number of chief stars capable of breaking from their assigned order, and warns that when that order breaks, first in ways only a trained observer would notice, and finally in ways any person looking up would see for themselves, the consequences extend beyond the sky itself into the food supply and the basic rhythm of life for whoever is standing under it. Modern Earth and space science, working with instruments and observational reach that would have been unimaginable to whoever compiled this text, has spent the last several decades independently documenting real, measurable versions of nearly every category of disruption this ancient warning describes: magnetic sector structures in the sun's own field, rotational speed instability serious enough to threaten global timekeeping standards, an active solar cycle producing individually disordered regions that outpaced official prediction, a weakening polar containment system already tied to real infrastructure disasters, a newly named and ranked category of concentrated water delivery responsible for both sustaining and periodically devastating an entire region, and a night sky that, for 1 week in May of 2024, put on a display over the backyards of people who had never had any reason to expect it and will likely never see anything like it again for years. There is a specific, practical reason this document has been treated across this video as worth this level of sustained attention, rather than as a curiosity to be summarized in a few minutes and set aside. And it has to do with the nature of the claims themselves, rather than any conclusion this video is asking you to accept. Most ancient prophetic material that gets compared against modern events and popular treatments relies on interpretive flexibility. Vague enough language that a wide range of later events can be read into it after the fact. A technique that has produced everything from popular readings of Nostradamus to a long tradition of retroactively fitting ancient astrological and prophetic texts to whatever happened to be making headlines at the time someone chose to revisit them. The astronomical Book of Enoch is a poor candidate for that kind of loose, after-the-fact fitting, precisely because of the quality this video has emphasized from its opening minutes: its specificity, gate ratios expressed as precise numerical fractions. A calendar built around an exact 364-day count with named intercalary points, 7 named chiefs, not an unspecified plurality, a described failure sequence with distinct, separately named stages, gates, chiefs, winds, and finally visible disorder, rather than one undifferentiated warning of vague future calamity. That specificity is exactly what makes the comparisons in this video falsifiable in a way looser prophetic material never is. A vague warning that the sky will show signs can be matched to almost anything. A specific claim that named chiefs among the stars will break from their prescribed paths, while the broader system continues functioning normally around them, is a claim that can genuinely fail to match observed reality, and the fact that it does not fail to match, at least for the specific and currently ongoing case of Solar Cycle 25's disordered active regions, is worth the weight this video has given it, without that weight requiring the conclusion that the ancient text possessed literal foreknowledge, a conclusion this video has deliberately and repeatedly declined to draw. Whether that pattern reflects genuine ancient insight preserved and transmitted across 2 millennia, coincidental convergence between a large ancient text and an equally large body of modern findings, or some combination the current evidence cannot fully disentangle, is a question this video has tried to lay out honestly rather than answer for you. What is not in question is that the document exists, that it says what it says, that it has been sitting largely unread in exactly the state described at the start of this video for far longer than most people watching would have guessed, and that the specific sky it describes, gate by gate, wind by wind, chief star by chief star, keeps showing up in its broad outline, if not its specific mechanism. In the data modern instruments are recording right now, this year, this solar cycle, this still unresolved and still ongoing moment in the actual physical sky above you.